The Age of Strife had left humanity scattered and broken across the stars. For nearly 5 millennia, warp storms of unprecedented ferocity had isolated human worlds from one another, severing the once mighty interstellar empire that had stretched across the galaxy. On Terra itself, cradle of mankind, techno-barbarians ruled over fractured domains, wielding the remnants of Dark Age technologies they barely understood. Nuclear wastelands stretched across once verdant continents, while genetically modified warrior kings commanded armies of twisted soldiers against their rivals. The oceans had boiled away, leaving barren salt flats where mighty seas once stood. The planet that had given birth to humanity had become a nightmarish parody of its former self. It was into this shattered world that the Emperor fully revealed himself. Though he had guided humanity from the shadows for millennia, moving through history under many guises and names, the desperate state of Terra following the Age of Strife demanded direct intervention. The Emperor possessed power beyond mortal comprehension, a being of immense psychic might, technological genius, and military acumen. His appearance marked the beginning of the Unification Wars, a bloody campaign to bring Terra under a single rule once more. The Unification Wars were not merely conquests, but a desperate struggle to salvage what remained of humanity's knowledge and technology before it was lost forever. The Emperor's armies marched against the techno-barbarian states of Ursh, Nordafric, High Brazil, and dozens of other fractured nations. The Indonesic bloc, ruled by the tyrant Cardinal Tang, fell after particularly brutal fighting. The Pan-Pacific Empire crumbled before the Emperor's forces. One by one, the domains of old Earth submitted to the master of mankind. Among the most dangerous opponents were the twisted gene cults of the Selenar on Luna, Terra's moon. These gene rights possessed knowledge of biological manipulation that would later prove crucial to the Emperor's plans. Their eventual defeat and forced cooperation secured vital technologies for the burgeoning Imperium. Similarly, the Ethnarchy of Caucasus, with their considerable psychic powers, required the direct intervention of the Emperor himself to overcome. To wage these wars of unification, the Emperor created the Thunder Warriors, genetically enhanced super soldiers who towered over normal men. These proto-Astartes were immensely powerful but flawed creations, unstable in both body and mind. Clad in primitive power armor and wielding devastating weapons, they were living engines of destruction led by generals like Ushatin, Goda, and Eric Tyrannes, the Lightning Bearer. The Thunder Warriors smashed through enemy fortifications and annihilated opposing armies with terrifying efficiency, but they were never meant to endure. They were weapons designed for the specific purpose of unifying Terra, not the Grand Crusade that was to follow. As Terra gradually came under the Emperor's control, he established the beginnings of imperial infrastructure. The Imperial Palace began its construction on the Himalaysian mountains, incorporating the ancient fortress that had served as the Emperor's base during the worst of the Age of Strife. The first imperial institutions took shape, the beginnings of what would become the Administratum, the Imperial Army, and other pillars of governance. Learned individuals who had preserved knowledge through the Age of Strife were gathered to form the foundation of a new human renaissance. The technological revival under the Emperor's guidance was remarkable but carefully controlled. Having witnessed the catastrophic consequences of unchecked technological development during the Dark Age of technology, the Emperor implemented strict protocols regarding certain fields of research. Artificial intelligence was explicitly forbidden, the horrors of the Iron Men rebellion still fresh in humanity's collective memory. Instead, focus was placed on rediscovering lost human technologies and adapting them to serve the nascent Imperium's needs. In his laboratories deep beneath the Himalaysian mountains, the Emperor worked on his greatest creation, the Primarch Project. Using his own genetic material and warp-based sciences that pushed the boundaries of human understanding, he crafted 20 superhuman beings intended to lead humanity into a new golden age. Each Primarch was designed with specific traits and abilities, embodying different aspects of the Emperor's own multifaceted nature. However, this project would face a devastating setback when the infant Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy by forces that many later attributed to the Chaos Gods, though such entities were not yet widely known or understood in those early days. Despite this catastrophic loss, the Emperor adapted his plans. Using the preserved genetic material of his scattered sons, he developed the gene seed that would transform ordinary men into space marines, the Adeptus Astartes. These warriors would be superior to the Thunder Warriors in stability and longevity, if somewhat less individually powerful. 20 legions were planned, each carrying the genetic legacy of one Primarch. As the Unification Wars reached their conclusion, the Thunder Warriors had served their purpose. Official Imperial histories record that these Proto-Astartes died gloriously at the Battle of Mount Ararat, their unstable physiologies finally failing them after years of combat. The truth, whispered only in forbidden texts, suggests a darker end, a purge orchestrated by the Emperor and carried out by the first of the new Astartes and other Imperial agents. The Thunder Warriors, with their limited lifespans and increasing instability, had no place in the Emperor's vision for the future. Their replacement by the more stable Space Marines was a calculated necessity in the Emperor's grand design. With Terra unified, the Emperor turned his gaze to Mars, the red planet that had once been the crown jewel of humanity's technological achievement. During the Age of Strife, Mars had evolved in isolation, developing the cult Mechanicum, a religion that venerated technology and knowledge as divine. The tech priests of Mars had preserved much of humanity's technological heritage, albeit wrapped in religious dogma and ritual that obscured true understanding. The Emperor approached this potential alliance with characteristic foresight. Rather than conquering Mars through force, which would have been costly and might have destroyed the very knowledge he sought to preserve, he negotiated. The Emperor traveled to Mars and met with the Fabricator General and the Mechanicum's ruling magi in the great temple complex atop Olympus Mons, the tallest mountain in the solar system. The resulting agreement, known as the Treaty of Olympus Mons, was a masterpiece of pragmatic compromise. The Emperor allowed the Mechanicum to maintain their religious practices, tacitly permitting them to view him as the physical incarnation of their machine god, the Omnissiah. In return, the Mechanicum pledged their allegiance to the Emperor and promised to provide the technological infrastructure, weapons, vehicles, and starships that would be essential for the reconquest of the galaxy. This treaty created the Adeptus Mechanicus as a semi-autonomous organization within the Imperium, maintaining its own hierarchy, traditions, and even territory. Mars became the center of Imperial technology, with forge worlds established throughout the expanding Imperium to support the massive industrial needs of the Great Crusade. The Mechanicum's vast knowledge and manufacturing capabilities proved invaluable, producing everything from Astartes' power armor to the mighty vessels of the Imperial fleet. The alliance was not without tension. Many in the Mechanicum viewed the Emperor's restrictions on certain technologies, particularly those involving artificial intelligence and some forms of genetic manipulation, as contrary to their quest for knowledge. Others questioned whether he truly was their Omnissiah. Nevertheless, the practical benefits of the alliance outweighed these concerns, and the Mechanicum became an essential component of the nascent Imperium. With Terra unified and Mars brought into the Imperial fold, the Emperor began preparations for humanity's return to the stars. The first Space Marine legions were established, with recruits drawn from Terra's various regions. The War Hounds, Imperial Heralds, Dark Angels, Emperor's Children, and other early legions took shape, each developing distinct identities even before being united with their Primarchs. The Imperial Army formed from the most capable soldiers of the Unification Wars, while the Mechanicum provided the vessels that would carry these forces to the stars. As the warp storms that had isolated Terra began to abate, the Emperor unveiled his grand vision to his closest confidants, a vision that would become known as the Great Crusade. Humanity would reclaim its lost colonies and forge a united Imperium spanning the galaxy. Human worlds would be liberated from Xeno's oppression, reunited with their species, and brought under the protective umbrella of Imperial rule. Alien races that threatened humanity would be eliminated, while human worlds that rejected Imperial authority would be forced to comply for their own protection and the greater good of the species. The philosophical underpinnings of this vision were complex and multifaceted. The Emperor saw a universe full of threats to human existence, predatory alien species, the corrupting influence of the warp, and humanity's own self-destructive tendencies. Only through unity, strength, and careful guidance could the human species survive these perils. The Emperor's ultimate goal, hinted at but never fully revealed to even his closest generals, appeared to be the psychic evolution of humanity into a more advanced species, free from the dangers of the warp while harnessing its power. Central to this vision was what would later be known as the Imperial Truth, a rationalist, secular philosophy that rejected religion, superstition, and the supernatural. The Emperor, despite his own psychic nature, presented these phenomena as simply manifestations of natural laws not yet fully understood. This stance was partly pragmatic. The Emperor had witnessed how religion could divide humanity, but also served to weaken the influence of the Chaos Gods by denying their divine nature. The Emperor's relationship with the warp was particularly nuanced. While he was perhaps the most powerful psyker humanity had ever produced, he recognized the dangers the Imperium presented. His grand project on Terra, later revealed to be the Golden Throne and Imperial Webway, was designed to free humanity from dependence on warp travel, while still allowing interstellar commerce and communication. This would protect the species from both the perils of warp travel and the predations of warp entities. As preparations for the Great Crusade neared completion, a sense of destiny permeated the Emperor's growing Imperium. After millennia of darkness, humanity would reclaim its birthright among the stars. The Emperor's vision of human unification and advancement inspired fervent loyalty among his followers, from the transhuman Astartes to the mortal soldiers and administrators who would carry his light to the darkest corners of the galaxy. The first expeditionary fleets prepared to leave the Sol system, venturing into the void to rediscover lost human worlds and confront whatever awaited them among the stars. The Great Crusade was about to begin, a military undertaking of unprecedented scale and ambition that would reshape the galaxy and determine the fate of countless worlds and species. Humanity, under the Emperor's guidance, stood poised to forge an empire that would span the stars and endure for millennia. With Terra unified and the alliance with Mars secured, the Emperor turned his full attention to creating the military force that would spearhead humanity's return to the stars. The loss of the Primarchs had been a devastating setback, but the Emperor was nothing if not adaptable. The genetic material he had harvested from his 20 sons would serve as the foundation for a new type of warrior, the Adeptus Astartes, or Space Marines. The development of gene seed technology represented one of the Emperor's most remarkable scientific achievements. Unlike the crude genetic modifications used to create the Thunder Warriors, gene seed was a sophisticated biological system designed to transform an ordinary human male into a transhuman warrior. Each gene seed contained 19 specialized organs that would be implanted into suitable recruits through a series of complex surgical procedures. These organs included the secondary heart, os medulla, biscopia, hemistamen, Laramann's organ, catalepsian node, preomner, omophagia, multi-lung, oculobe, Lyman's ear, Susan membrane, melanochrome, otolytic kidney, neuroglottis, mucranoid, Becher's gland, progenid glands, and the black carapace. The progenid glands were perhaps the most crucial component of this system. These specialized organs absorbed genetic material from the other implants, and over time, matured to contain the genetic template needed to create new gene seed. This allowed the legions Astartes to be self-perpetuating, with each Space Marine potentially contributing to the creation of future battle brothers. The black carapace, meanwhile, provided a subdermal interface that allowed a Space Marine to connect directly with his power armor, essentially making the armor an extension of his own body. Each of the 20 Space Marine legions was founded using gene seed derived from one of the missing Primarchs. This created distinctive traits within each legion that would become more pronounced once they were reunited with their gene fathers. The Dark Angels, created from the gene seed of the first Primarch, displayed remarkable tactical flexibility and discipline. The Emperor's children, bearing the genetic legacy of the third Primarch, strove for perfection in all their endeavors. The Imperial Fists inherited their Primarch's stubbornness and skill at siege warfare, while the White Scars received their gene father's speed and ferocity. The initial recruitment for these legions came exclusively from Terra. The war-torn regions of Old Earth provided an abundance of suitable candidates, young men who had survived the harsh conditions of the unification wars and possessed the physical and mental resilience required to endure the gene seed implantation process. The mountains of the Himalayan range yielded recruits for the emperor's children, while the brutal gangers of the Albion hives provided aspirants for the 8th Legion. The nomadic tribes of the Thelian Basin became the foundation of the White Scars, and the warlike clans of Ursh contributed many warriors to the World Eaters. The process of creating a space marine was neither quick nor guaranteed. Many aspirants died during the implantation procedures or were driven mad by the changes wrought upon their bodies. Those who survived emerged as something more than human, taller, stronger, faster, and more resilient than any natural human could hope to be. Their enhanced physiology allowed them to survive wounds that would kill an ordinary man, while their augmented senses and accelerated thought processes made them supremely effective warriors. The organizational structure of these early legions differed significantly from the chapter-based system that would emerge after the Horus Heresy. Each legion was a massive formation, numbering anywhere from 10,000 to over 250,000 Astartes at their peak. They were divided into chapters, which were further split into companies, battalions, and squads. Command hierarchies varied between legions, with some adopting rigid chains of authority, while others employed more flexible command structures. As the legion's Astartes took shape, the Emperor also established the framework for the expeditionary fleets that would carry the Great Crusade to the stars. These fleets were complex military formations consisting of multiple elements. At their core were the Space Marine detachments, ranging from a few companies to an entire legion, depending on the fleet's size and mission. Supporting these transhuman warriors were regiments of the Imperial Army, the conventional military force composed of baseline humans. The Imperial Army evolved from the unified military forces that had fought in the later stages of the unification wars. Unlike the specialized legions Astartes, the Imperial Army was a combined arms force with diverse capabilities. It included infantry regiments, armored divisions, artillery formations, and engineering corps. While individual soldiers of the Imperial Army could not match the combat prowess of an Astartes, they provided the numerical strength needed to secure conquered territories and maintain supply lines. The expeditionary fleets also incorporated elements of the Mechanicum. Tech priests maintained the vessels and war machines, while Skitarii regiments fought alongside the Imperial Army. Collegia Titanica engines sometimes accompanied larger fleets, providing devastating firepower capable of leveling entire cities. Legio Cybernetica cohorts deployed their battle automata to support ground operations, carefully controlled to avoid the catastrophic AI rebellions of the past. The naval component of these fleets came from the Imperial Navy, which operated the massive warships and transports needed to traverse the void between stars. These vessels ranged from nimble frigates and destroyers to massive battleships and the awe-inspiring Gloriana-class flagships assigned to the Primarchs. The most common vessel was the cruiser, versatile ships that formed the backbone of most fleets. The largest expeditionary fleets might contain hundreds of vessels, while smaller ones operated with just a handful of ships. Coordination between these diverse elements was managed by the fleet command structure, typically led by a high-ranking Astartes officer in Legion-heavy fleets or an Imperial Army Lord commander in others. Iterators, skilled orators, and diplomats accompanied the fleets to facilitate the peaceful integration of human worlds into the Imperium. Remembrancers, added later in the Crusade, documented the achievements of the fleets for posterity. While the expeditionary fleets represented the visible face of imperial expansion, the Emperor also established several clandestine organizations to address threats that could not be confronted through conventional warfare. Chief among these was the Officio Assassinorum, founded under the leadership of the enigmatic figure known as Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor. The Officio Assassinorum trained specialized operatives to eliminate specific targets whose removal could prevent conflicts or hasten compliance. It was organized into distinct temples, each specializing in different assassination techniques. The Vindicare Temple produced peerless snipers capable of making seemingly impossible shots. The Calidus Temple specialized in infiltration and disguise, their operatives able to assume the appearance of their targets through the use of polymorphine. The Culexus Temple trained psychic blanks to target and eliminate enemy psychers, while the Aversir Temple created living weapons, drug-enhanced berserkers unleashed to sow terror and destruction. Other secretive imperial institutions established during this period included the Adeptus Munitorum, responsible for the logistical demands of the expanding Imperium, and the Divisio Telepathica, which trained and monitored human psychers. The Astronomicon, a psychic beacon powered by the Emperor himself and maintained by thousands of psychers, provided the navigational reference point essential for warp travel across the expanding Imperium. Perhaps the most secretive of all the Emperor's organizations was what would later become known as the Inquisition. Though not formally established until the closing days of the Horus Heresy, its precursors existed during the Great Crusade in the form of various intelligence gathering and internal security agencies. These groups monitored for signs of corruption, sedition, or Xeno's influence within newly compliant worlds and even within the Imperium's own forces. The Emperor's decision to create and rely upon transhuman warriors rather than conventional military forces stemmed from both practical necessity and long-term strategic considerations. The galaxy that humanity sought to reclaim was filled with threats that conventional human soldiers could not effectively combat. Hostile alien species like the orcs possessed physical strength and resilience that outmatched unaugmented humans. Ancient human colonies had diverged genetically or culturally, sometimes developing formidable defensive capabilities. Warp-influenced entities presented dangers that required specialized countermeasures. The Space Marines were designed specifically to overcome these challenges. Their enhanced physiology allowed them to fight effectively against physically superior Xenos. Their indoctrination and psychological conditioning provided resistance against fear, corruption, and warp influence. Their rapid deployment capabilities enabled them to respond quickly to threats across vast distances. In essence, they were the perfect shock troops for the initial stages of Imperial expansion. Furthermore, the Legions Astartes represented a force that was unquestionably loyal to the Emperor and his vision. Unlike conventional military forces, which might develop regional loyalties or political ambitions, the Space Marines were created with genetic predispositions toward loyalty and duty. Their indoctrination emphasized absolute dedication to the Emperor and the Imperial Truth. This made them not just effective warriors, but also reliable instruments of the Emperor's will. The Space Marines also served as powerful symbols of Imperial might. The sight of these transhuman warriors in their distinctive power armor had a profound psychological impact on both enemies and potential allies. Human worlds contemplating resistance often reconsidered when confronted with Astartes. Compliant populations viewed them with awe and reverence, reinforcing the quasi-divine status that the Emperor increasingly acquired despite his stated opposition to being worshipped. However, the Emperor recognized the limitations of relying too heavily on the Legions Astartes. There were simply too few Space Marines to garrison an empire spanning thousands of worlds. The transformation process was time-consuming and resource-intensive, with many candidates failing to survive the implantation procedures. Furthermore, the specialized nature of Space Marines made them ill-suited for certain aspects of Imperial expansion, such as administration, diplomacy, and infrastructure development. This recognition informed the development of the Imperial Army as a complementary force. While Space Marines served as the spearhead of conquest, conventional military forces provided the numbers needed to secure and hold territory. The Imperial Army also offered a path to military service for the countless billions of humans who could never become Astartes, helping to integrate diverse populations into the Imperial system. As the first expeditionary fleets prepared to depart the Sol system, the Emperor's grand design began to take tangible form. The Legions Astartes, though not yet at full strength, had already proven their effectiveness in consolidating Imperial control over the solar system. The alliance with Mars was producing the ships, weapons, and equipment needed for galactic conquest at an astonishing rate. The administrative frameworks necessary to govern an expanding empire were taking shape under Malkador's guidance. The Great Crusade stood ready to begin, a massive military undertaking aimed at reuniting the scattered fragments of humanity under the Emperor's rule. The transhuman warriors of the legions Astartes would lead this effort, bringing the light of Imperial Truth to worlds long isolated by the warp storms of old night. Behind them would come the ships, soldiers, administrators, and colonists who would transform these reconquered territories into functioning parts of the newborn Imperium. The Emperor's most ambitious scientific endeavor began in the gene laboratories deep beneath the Himalaysian mountains on Terra. While the Thunder Warriors had served their purpose in unifying humanity's cradle world, they were but crude prototypes, unstable creations with limited lifespans. The Emperor envisioned warriors of far greater potential, led by generals who would embody his own superhuman qualities. This vision gave birth to the Primarch Project, perhaps the most sophisticated work of genetic engineering in human history. The creation of the Primarchs involved technologies and techniques that blended advanced genetic science with arcane knowledge of the Imperium. The Emperor drew upon his own genetic material as the foundation, then modified and enhanced it through processes that few minds in the galaxy could comprehend. Each Primarch was designed with specific strengths and characteristics, their genetic codes meticulously crafted to emphasize particular traits while maintaining an overall template of transhuman excellence. The laboratory facilities where this work took place were among the most secure locations on Terra. Protected by concentric rings of defenses, both physical and psychic, these chambers contained equipment salvaged from humanity's dark age of technology, alongside devices of the Emperor's own design. Specialized growth chambers housed the developing Primarchs, their accelerated maturation carefully monitored by cogitators and the Emperor's most trusted janitors. Nutrient fluids specially formulated for each Primarch's unique physiology circulated through these chambers, while precisely calibrated energy fields stimulated proper tissue development. Beyond mere physical attributes, the Emperor encoded each Primarch with specific cognitive patterns and innate knowledge. Military strategy, leadership principles, and technical expertise were woven directly into their developing minds. Yet the Emperor also left room for personality development, understanding that his sons would need to be more than simply living weapons. They would need to inspire, to lead, and to make independent decisions in his absence. The 20 Primarchs represented different facets of the Emperor's own multifaceted nature. One embodied his strategic brilliance, another his diplomatic acumen, a third his indomitable resilience. Some would excel at void warfare, others at ground campaigns. Some were designed with greater psychic potential, while others possessed unmatched physical strength. Together, they would form a leadership cadre of unprecedented capability, each complementing the other's strengths and compensating for their weaknesses. The Emperor's plans were meticulous, but even he could not anticipate or prevent what happened next. As the infant Primarchs developed in their gestation capsules, forces from beyond the material realm intervened. The entities that would later be recognized as the Ruinous Powers, though such knowledge was suppressed during the Great Crusade, enacted a plan to disrupt the Emperor's grand design. In a moment that would alter the course of galactic history, a warp storm of impossible intensity manifested within the heart of the Emperor's most secure laboratory. Reality itself tore open, and through this breach, the nascent Primarchs were snatched from their gestation capsules and hurled across the galaxy. In an instant, the Emperor's carefully crafted plan lay in ruins, his 20 sons scattered to distant worlds where they would develop beyond his direct influence. The exact mechanics of this catastrophic event remain a subject of debate among Imperial scholars. Some accounts suggest that the laboratory's gellar fields failed at a crucial moment, while others imply that the psychic protections were deliberately sabotaged from within. The most forbidden texts hint that the Emperor's bargain with the Chaos Gods at Malech, a pact that granted him the power to create the Primarchs in the first place, was the true cause, the Ruinous Powers simply claiming what they considered rightfully theirs. Whatever the precise cause, the consequences were immediate and devastating. The Emperor arrived at the laboratory to find the gestation capsules shattered, his sons gone. Only traces of their genetic material remained, samples that would prove crucial in the Emperor's revised plans, but a poor substitute for the Primarchs themselves. The master of mankind rarely displayed emotion, but witnesses reported that in this moment, his facade of calm detachment briefly faltered, revealing a glimpse of genuine anguish. The infant Primarchs, meanwhile, were cast through the warp to worlds spanning the breadth of the galaxy. The nature of their transit through the Imperium meant that time flowed differently for each. Some materialized on their destination worlds almost immediately after their abduction, while others spent what might have been years in transit, aging at accelerated rates within their protective capsules. This temporal distortion explains why some Primarchs, when eventually discovered, appeared to have spent decades on their adoptive worlds despite the relatively short time since their disappearance from Terra. The worlds that received these transhuman children were as diverse as the Primarchs themselves. Some landed on death worlds, where survival required constant vigilance and martial prowess. Others found themselves on civilized planets with advanced technologies. A few were adopted by human cultures that recognized their potential, while others were raised by more humble families or even forced to survive alone in hostile environments. In each case, the world and culture that raised the Primarch would leave an indelible mark on his character, creating distinctions that went beyond the Emperor's genetic programming. Back on Terra, the Emperor faced a critical decision. The Primarch project had been central to his plans for humanity's reconquest of the stars. Without these design generals, the Great Crusade might falter before it began. After a period of consideration that some accounts suggest lasted no more than a single night, the Emperor unveiled his contingency plan, the creation of the Space Marine Legions. Using the preserved genetic material from each Primarch, the Emperor developed the process to create gene seed, the biological technology that would transform ordinary human males into transhuman Astartes. Each legion's gene seed derived from one Primarch, creating 20 distinct genetic lineages. This connection would prove to be more than merely biological. It established a psycho-spiritual link between each legion and its absent Primarch. This connection manifested in several ways. Most obviously, Space Marines developed physical traits reminiscent of their Primarch's appearance. Facial features, skin tone, and even certain mannerisms would gradually align with those of their gene father. More subtly, each legion developed cultural and tactical tendencies that mirrored their Primarch's innate proclivities, even before the legions knew these transhuman progenitors existed. The White Scars displayed a preference for rapid assault and mobile warfare that perfectly matched the combat philosophy of their Primarch, Jagatai Khan. The Imperial Fists developed an affinity for siege warfare and defensive operations that reflected Rogel Dorn's methodical approach to combat. The Night Lords exhibited terror tactics and psychological warfare that aligned with Conrad Kerr's brutal sense of justice. These parallels emerged organically, suggesting a connection deeper than mere genetics. Apothecaries and librarians who studied this phenomenon theorized that the gene seed contained more than physical traits. It somehow transmitted aspects of the Primarch's consciousness to his sons. Some went further, suggesting that each legion and its Primarch formed a collective psychic entity, with the Primarch serving as its focal point. While such theories were discouraged under the secular Imperial Truth, they gained credence when Primarchs were eventually reunited with their legions, and the bonds between them proved immediate and profound. The psycho-spiritual connection between Primarchs and their legions proved most evident in the case of Psyker Primarchs. The Thousand Sons, carrying the gene seed of Magnus the Red, displayed a significantly higher incidence of psychic abilities than other legions. Similarly, the Blood Angels inherited not only Sanguinius's noble countenance, but also fragments of his prophetic visions, and more disturbingly, the genetic flaw that would become known as the Red Thirst. This connection worked both ways. When Primarchs were eventually discovered and reunited with their legions, they often reported an immediate sense of recognition and belonging. Many described the experience as coming home, despite never having met their sons before. Some Primarchs even displayed knowledge of their legion's campaigns and traditions that they could not have learned through conventional means, suggesting a subconscious awareness of their sons' experiences. The Emperor's contingency plan, following the loss of the Primarchs, demonstrated his remarkable adaptability. Rather than abandoning the Great Crusade or delaying it until the Primarchs could be found, he he proceeded with the legions Astartes as the spearhead of his reconquest. Simultaneously, he initiated efforts to locate his scattered sons, knowing that their recovery would dramatically enhance the Crusade's effectiveness. To compensate for the Primarch's absence, the Emperor personally led the early expeditionary fleets. His presence on the battlefield was often decisive, his transhuman generals learning warfare directly from the master of mankind himself. The first found Primarchs similarly received personal tutelage from the Emperor, being integrated into his inner circle and groomed for their intended roles as leaders of the Great Crusade. The Emperor also established alternative command structures within each legion. The first generation of Space Marines recruited from Terra formed the officer cadre, with particularly distinguished warriors elevated to positions like Legion Master or First Captain. These commanders would later serve as crucial bridges between their Primarchs and the legions they inherited, helping to integrate the Gene Fathers into existing legion cultures and hierarchies. Perhaps most importantly, the Emperor embedded within each legion a sense of purpose that transcended their Primarch's absence. The Great Crusade itself became their defining mission, the reunification of humanity under the Imperial Truth. This ideological foundation provided stability and direction even as the legions evolved and eventually came under their Primarch's leadership. The Emperor's foresight extended to preparing for the possibility that some Primarchs might never be found, or might be found changed by their experiences in ways that rendered them unsuitable for their intended roles. Contingency protocols established chains of succession within each legion, ensuring that the loss of a Primarch, whether through death or other circumstances, would not cripple the legion's command structure. These protocols would later prove crucial during the Horus Heresy, allowing loyalist legions to maintain operational effectiveness despite the loss of their Primarchs. As the Great Crusade progressed and Primarchs were gradually discovered, the Emperor's contingency plans gave way to his original vision. Each recovered son took command of his legion, reshaping it according to his own martial philosophy, while building upon the foundations established in his absence. The legions grew in size and capability under their Primarch's leadership, becoming the conquering armies the Emperor had originally envisioned. The recovery of the Primarchs validated the Emperor's decision to proceed with the Great Crusade despite their loss. By the time the last Primarch was discovered, the Imperium had already expanded to encompass thousands of worlds. The infrastructure of conquest was well established, allowing the completed Primarch Legion pairs to accelerate the pace of Imperial expansion rather than initiating it from scratch. As the first rays of Terra's sun glinted off the massive fleet assembled in high orbit, the Emperor stood on the observation deck of his flagship, the Bucephalus. The vessels represented the largest concentration of military might humanity had gathered since the Dark Age of technology. Warships of varying classes stretched as far as the eye could see, from nimble escort frigates to massive battleships whose silhouettes blotted out the stars behind them. This was the vanguard of humanity's reconquest, the first wave of expeditionary fleets that would carry the Imperial Truth to the galaxy. The initial push beyond the Sol system began cautiously. The Emperor himself led the first major expedition, designated as the First Expeditionary Fleet, accompanied by elements of several Space Marine legions. Their target was the Proxima Centauri system, humanity's closest stellar neighbor, and once a thriving colony during the Dark Age of technology. Long-range auger scans had detected signs of human habitation, but centuries of isolation had left the system's current status unknown. Upon arrival, the fleet discovered that Proxima had indeed maintained a human presence, but the colony had regressed technologically and fractured into competing nation-states. Initial diplomatic overtures were met with suspicion by the planet's ruling council, who had developed a quasi-religious society that viewed technology as sacred artifacts rather than tools to be understood. When the Emperor personally addressed the council and explained the Imperial Truth, many leaders recognized the benefits of rejoining the human fold. However, a faction led by High Prelate Dernheck rejected imperial authority, viewing it as a threat to their religious control. What followed became known as the Proximan betrayal. During a ceremonial banquet to formalize the planet's compliance, Hex followers launched a surprise attack on the Imperial delegation. Several army officers died in the initial assault, but the Space Marines present, warriors of the 7th Legion, responded with devastating efficiency, cutting down the attackers within minutes. The Emperor, demonstrating both mercy and pragmatism, offered Hex one final opportunity to accept Imperial rule. When this was refused, he authorized a limited military action targeting only Hex power base. The operation lasted less than a day, with precision strikes eliminating key military installations while minimizing civilian casualties. With their leadership decapitated and military capabilities neutralized, the remaining Proximan factions quickly accepted compliance. The Proximan betrayal established several important precedents for the Great Crusade. It demonstrated the Emperor's preference for peaceful integration where possible, but also his willingness to use overwhelming force when necessary. It highlighted the effectiveness of Space Marines as shock troops, and it established protocols for dealing with human worlds that rejected Imperial authority. Most importantly, it provided a template for what would become known as Imperial compliance, the process by which newly discovered human worlds were incorporated into the Imperium. As formalized in the aftermath of Proxima, Imperial compliance typically followed a standard sequence. First came contact and assessment, where Imperial representatives evaluated the world's technological level, cultural development, and potential threats. This was followed by diplomatic engagement, with iterators presenting the benefits of Imperial membership. If accepted, integration would begin, establishing Imperial institutions and infrastructure. If rejected, graduated military response would follow, escalating from demonstrations of force to limited strikes, and finally to full-scale invasion if necessary. The compliance process varied significantly depending on the world's circumstances. Planets suffering under alien domination would see the Xenos threat eliminated before compliance procedures began. Human worlds with compatible technological and cultural frameworks might be integrated with minimal disruption, while those with incompatible religious or political systems often required more extensive restructuring. Particularly valuable worlds, those with rare resources or strategic locations, might receive preferential treatment, with additional resources allocated to their development. Following the success at Proxima, the Emperor authorized the deployment of additional expeditionary fleets. The Second Fleet, commanded by Legion Master Ultras of the 13th Legion, ventured toward the Centauri Reach, while the Third Fleet under Lord Commander Thaddeus Fabian explored the systems along the Golgothan sector. Within 5 years of the Crusade's launch, over 30 major expeditionary fleets were operating independently, with countless smaller forces branching off to investigate systems of secondary importance. These early fleets operated with considerable autonomy due to the challenges of interstellar communication. While astropathic messages could transmit orders across vast distances, the unreliability of the warp meant that fleet commanders needed authority to make decisions based on local conditions. The Emperor established clear strategic objectives and compliance protocols, but tactical decisions remained with the commanders in the field. The composition of these fleets evolved based on early experiences. The typical expeditionary fleet centered around a contingent of Space Marines, usually between 1,000 and 3,000 warriors, though larger operations might involve multiple legions or even an entire legion deployment of tens of thousands. Supporting these transhuman soldiers were regiments of the Imperial Army, whose numbers varied based on the fleet's size and mission parameters. Naval assets included a mix of vessel types, with battleships or grand cruisers serving as flagships, supported by strike cruisers for Space Marine deployment and lighter vessels for reconnaissance and escort duties. Mechanicum elements provided technical support, maintaining the fleet's vessels and equipment while contributing their own combat forces when needed. Supply ships, hospital vessels, and troop transports rounded out these massive armadas, some of which numbered hundreds of ships. One of the most significant early campaigns beyond Proxima was the pacification of the Thonia system. Located relatively close to Terra, Thonia had once been a mining colony, its planet's resources extensively exploited during the Dark Age of technology. By the time the 8th Expeditionary Fleet arrived, Thonia was a depleted world of tunnels and caverns, its population organized into brutal gangs fighting for scarce resources. Despite these harsh conditions, the Thonians had maintained a form of civilization and even preserved some advanced technologies. Initial compliance efforts focused on humanitarian aid, with Imperial ships delivering food, medicine, and clean water to the population. This goodwill gesture was followed by the establishment of recruitment centers, as Thonian gangers proved to be excellent candidates for both the Imperial Army and the 16th Legion, whose gene seed seemed particularly compatible with the Thonian genetic makeup. The integration of Thonia demonstrated another aspect of Imperial compliance, the identification and utilization of human resources. Worlds with populations that showed particular aptitudes or genetic compatibility with Space Marine gene seed often received specialized attention. Thonia's value as a recruitment world ultimately outweighed its depleted material resources, making it a net asset to the expanding Imperium despite its environmental degradation. Not all early compliance actions proceeded as smoothly as Thonia. The Shedem Drifts campaign encountered fierce resistance from human worlds that had formed a defensive coalition during Old Night. These planets had developed a shared cultural identity based on their survival of the Age of Strife, and viewed the Imperium as simply another would-be conqueror. It took 3 years of combined military operations and intensive diplomatic efforts to bring the 16 worlds of the Drifts into compliance. The Shedem experience highlighted the importance of the iterators within the expeditionary fleets. These specially trained orators and diplomats served as the Emperor's voice, articulating the Imperial Truth and explaining the benefits of compliance to newly discovered human populations. Iterators underwent extensive training in rhetoric, psychology, and cultural adaptation, allowing them to tailor their messages to specific audiences. A skilled iterator could accomplish with words what might otherwise require military force. During the compliance of Terach, iterator Kyril Sinderman famously converted an entire planet's ruling class through a series of 12 public debates with local religious leaders. His systematic dismantling of their theological arguments, combined with practical demonstrations of imperial technology, convinced the Terratian Council to voluntarily dismantle their theocratic government and accept imperial rule. The iterators' effectiveness stemmed partly from their genuine belief in the Imperial Truth. Most were recruited from Terra's intellectual elite, philosophers, scholars, and orators who had embraced the Emperor's secular rationalism. They viewed themselves not as propagandists, but as educators, bringing enlightenment to human worlds that had fallen into superstition and ignorance during the Age of Strife. This conviction gave their arguments a persuasive power that mere rhetoric could not achieve. Approximately 8 years into the Great Crusade, the Emperor authorized the addition of another civilian element to the expeditionary fleets, the Remembrancers. While iterators focused on spreading the Imperial Truth to newly compliant worlds, Remembrancers documented the achievements of the Crusade itself. These artists, historians, poets, and imagists were tasked with recording humanity's reconquest of the stars for posterity. The Remembrancer Order was established partly in response to concerns raised by Malcador the Sigillite, who argued that the Crusade's achievements deserved preservation in cultural memory, not merely in dry military reports. The Emperor agreed, recognizing that the Imperium needed not just military conquest, but also cultural foundations. The Remembrancers would provide future generations with inspiring accounts of humanity's greatest undertaking. Initial reactions to the Remembrancers varied among the expeditionary fleets. Some commanders welcomed them, appreciating the importance of documenting their achievements. Others viewed them as unnecessary civilians who consumed resources and required protection. Space Marine legions were particularly divided on the matter. The Emperor's children embraced the Remembrancers enthusiastically, seeing their work as a way to preserve the Legion's pursuit of perfection, while the Death Guard largely ignored them, finding little value in artistic interpretations of warfare. The early years of expansion beyond Sol also saw the development of standardized protocols for dealing with xeno species encountered during the Crusade. The Emperor's policy toward aliens was generally hostile, based on humanity's negative experiences during the Age of Strife. Many human worlds had suffered under alien domination during this period, and the Emperor was determined to ensure such subjugation never occurred again. Most hostile xenos encountered by the early expeditionary fleets were relatively primitive or isolated species that posed limited threats. These were typically eliminated with clinical efficiency. More advanced alien civilizations required larger military commitments, sometimes involving multiple fleets. The Orc domains encountered in the Terran Corridor were particularly troublesome, requiring extensive campaigns to clear them from human-settled regions. In rare cases, non-hostile xeno species were permitted to continue existing if they posed no threat to human expansion and occupied worlds of little value to the Imperium. Such exceptions were uncommon and usually temporary, with these species often targeted for elimination in later phases of the Crusade. The Diasporex, a combined human-xenos fleet-based civilization, represented one of the more notable exceptions, maintaining their independence for several decades before eventually being destroyed for their refusal to separate from their alien allies. As the first decade of the Great Crusade drew to a close, the Imperium had expanded to encompass over 200 major systems, with hundreds more in various stages of compliance. The early expeditionary fleets had established effective operational patterns that would serve as templates for the thousands of fleets that followed. The infrastructure of conquest, from compliance protocols to supply chains, had been refined through practical experience. The Emperor continued to personally lead the first expeditionary fleet during this period, though he increasingly delegated authority to trusted commanders as the scale of operations expanded. His presence on the front lines served multiple purposes. It demonstrated his commitment to the Crusade, provided opportunities to test and refine compliance protocols under his direct supervision, and allowed him to personally search for his scattered Primarchs while expanding Imperial territory. This first phase of expansion beyond Saul laid the groundwork for the accelerated conquest that would follow as the Primarchs were gradually discovered and reunited with their legions. The methods developed during these early years, from iterator diplomacy to compliance classifications, would become standard operating procedures for the hundreds of expeditionary fleets that would eventually span the galaxy, carrying the Emperor's light to the darkest reaches of space. The discovery of the first Primarch sent shockwaves through the Imperium's military hierarchy. After years of relentless expansion across the stars, the Emperor's grand vision was about to take a pivotal turn. The Great Crusade had established momentum with hundreds of worlds brought to compliance, but the arrival of these transhuman gene fathers would transform the very nature of the campaign. When Horus was discovered on the mining world of Thonia, the impact was immediate. As the first Primarch to be reunited with the Emperor, he quickly became the template for how these reunifications would reshape the Crusade. The Emperor personally took Horus under his wing, spending more time with him than he would with any of his later found sons. This special relationship gave Horus unique insights into the Emperor's vision for humanity and the reasoning behind the Great Crusade. The strategic implications of finding Horus extended far beyond a simple military advantage. The 16th Legion, already an effective fighting force, underwent a dramatic transformation upon reuniting with their gene father. Their combat effectiveness increased by an estimated 40% within the first year alone. This improvement wasn't merely due to Horus's tactical brilliance, but stemmed from a profound psychological shift within the Legion itself. Astartes, who had served for decades, described the sensation as finding their true purpose. The innate connection between Gene Seed and Primarch created a bond that transcended normal military loyalty. Space Marines of the 16th Legion experienced heightened morale, increased unit cohesion, and even subtle physiological changes as their bodies further aligned with their Primarch's genetic template. Their armor, once adorned with simple Imperial iconography, now bore the Eye of Horus, symbolizing their transformed identity as the Sons of Horus. This pattern would repeat with each Primarch discovery, though with significant variations based on the unique character of both Primarch and Legion. The Dark Angels, under Lionel Johnson, became more secretive and hierarchical, adopting the knightly traditions of Caliban. The Ultramarines embraced Roboute Guilliman's organizational genius, restructuring themselves according to his theoretical and practical military doctrines. The World Eaters, upon meeting Angron, shifted from disciplined shock troops to berserker assault specialists, mirroring their Primarchs' uncontrollable rage. These transformations weren't merely cosmetic or cultural. The fighting style of each legion evolved to complement their Primarchs' natural proclivities. The White Scars, who had always favored mobility, fully embraced their identity as swift hunters under Jagatai Khan, incorporating Chagorian cavalry traditions into their mechanized warfare. The Imperial Fists, reunited with Rogel Dorn, refined their already formidable siegecraft into an art form, becoming the Imperium's preeminent experts in fortification and defensive warfare. The psychological impact of these reunifications extended to the Primarchs themselves. Many had risen to positions of leadership on their adoptive worlds, but assuming command of tens of thousands of transhuman warriors created in their genetic image presented unique challenges. Some, like Guilliman and Dorn, seamlessly integrated into their new roles, their natural leadership qualities perfectly suited to Legion command. Others struggled with the transition. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors reportedly spent months studying every campaign his Legion had fought before his discovery, memorizing the name of every officer and notable battle brother, determined to master his inheritance completely. Angron's case proved particularly problematic. Unlike his brothers who had conquered or led their adoptive worlds, Angron had been a slave gladiator who failed to escape his captors despite leading a massive uprising. The Emperor's intervention, teleporting Angron to safety while leaving his fellow gladiators to die, created immediate friction. When presented with command of the Warhound's Legion, Angron's first act was to demand they implant themselves with the same neural implants that had been forced upon him, the Butcher's nails. This decision fundamentally altered the Legion's temperament, transforming them into the savage World Eaters and setting them on a path that would have dire consequences. The cultural transformation of the Legions following reunification often reflected the societies that had raised their Primarchs. The Space Wolves, under Leman Russ, adopted the warrior traditions of Fenris, incorporating ritualistic elements that seemed at odds with the secular Imperial Truth. The Thousand Sons, led by Magnus the Red, embraced the scholarly traditions of Prospero, becoming a legion of warrior scholars who valued knowledge as much as martial prowess. The Death Guard took on Mortarian stoic resilience, specializing in warfare under the most toxic and hazardous conditions. These cultural shifts sometimes created tension with established Legion traditions. Veterans who had served since the early days of the Crusade occasionally resisted changes imposed by their newly arrived Gene Fathers. The Emperor's children faced particular challenges when Fulgrim reorganized the Legion's command structure, sidelining some long-serving officers in favor of warriors who better embodied his pursuit of perfection. In the Word Bearers, Lorgar's religious inclinations clashed with the secular indoctrination of his sons, though they ultimately embraced his perspective with dangerous zeal. The relationship between the Emperor and his rediscovered sons varied dramatically, influenced by both the circumstances of their reunions and their individual temperaments. Horus, as the first found, enjoyed a closeness with the Emperor that none of his brothers would experience. They campaigned together for 3 decades before the second Primarch was discovered, forming a bond that made Horus the natural choice for Warmaster when the Emperor eventually returned to Terra. Other Primarchs had more complex relationships with their creator. Magnus, the Red, connected with the Emperor over their shared psychic abilities, engaging in discussions about the nature of the warp that excluded their non-psychic brothers. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels inspired such affection that many believed he was the Emperor's favorite son, though the angel himself never claimed such distinction. Guilliman established himself as a reliable administrator whose competence earned the Emperor's trust, while Dorn's steadfast loyalty made him the natural choice to fortify the Imperial Palace. Some reunions proved immediately problematic. Mortarion harbored resentment that the Emperor had killed his adoptive father, denying him his vengeance after years of struggle. Angron never forgave the Emperor for his abrupt extraction from New Syria. Kerr's mental instability created immediate concerns, though his effectiveness as a terror weapon initially outweighed these reservations. Alfarius, the last discovered, had the least time with his father before the Emperor returned to Terra, their relationship defined more by briefings and strategic directives than personal connection. The Emperor's approach to his sons showed remarkable adaptability. With Horus, he was a mentor, personally guiding his development as a commander. With Guilliman, he engaged as a fellow statesman, discussing governance and logistics. With Magnus, he shared knowledge of the warp, though carefully limiting what secrets he revealed. With Russ, he established a relationship based on unquestioning loyalty, creating the Emperor's executioner, who would enforce his will when necessary. This varied approach reflected the Emperor's pragmatic understanding of his sons' natures and the roles he envisioned for them. He did not treat the Primarchs as identical military assets, but as unique individuals whose distinct qualities could serve different aspects of his grand design. This personalized management style initially created strong bonds of loyalty, though it would later contribute to feelings of favoritism and resentment among some Primarchs. The shifting power dynamics within the Crusade's command structure accelerated as more Primarchs took control of their legions. Previously, authority had been relatively straightforward. The Emperor commanded the Crusade through his designated officers, with clear chains of command within each expeditionary fleet. The introduction of 20 demigod-like beings with their own ambitions and perspectives complicated this arrangement considerably. Nominal equality existed among the Primarchs, but informal hierarchies quickly developed. Horus, with his head start and close relationship with the Emperor, naturally assumed a position of first among equals. Primarchs like Dorn, Guilliman, and Sanguinius established themselves as respected voices whose counsel carried particular weight. Others, like Kurz and Angron, found themselves marginalized due to their volatile natures, while Primarchs like the Khan and Korax often operated independently, avoiding the political maneuvering of their brothers. These dynamics became particularly evident at the Council of Nicaea, where the Emperor gathered his sons to address the controversial use of psychic powers within the legions. The debate revealed deep philosophical divisions among the Primarchs. Magnus advocated for embracing psychic potential, while Mortarion and Russ argued vehemently against it. The Emperor's decision to restrict psychic usage, while establishing the Librarius as a controlled exception, satisfied neither extreme, highlighting the challenges of managing his strong-willed sons. As the Primarchs assumed command of their legions, the pace of the Great Crusade accelerated dramatically. Conquest that might have taken decades under normal Astartes commanders could be accomplished in years under a Primarch's leadership. The 13th Legion had brought 70 worlds to compliance in the 30 years before finding Guilliman. Under his command, they added 500 worlds in the next century. The Night Lords under Kurz pacified entire sectors through fear alone, their Primarch's reputation for brutality often sufficient to secure compliance without firing a shot. This increased efficiency stemmed from several factors. The Primarch's tactical genius allowed them to identify optimal strategies that minimized casualties while maximizing results. Their transhuman charisma inspired unparalleled loyalty and effort from their forces. Their personal combat prowess could turn the tide of battles that might otherwise have required months of conventional warfare. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological impact of a Primarch's presence, both on Imperial forces and potential opponents, created advantages that transcended normal military calculations. The accelerated pace of conquest created new logistical challenges. Guilliman pioneered solutions through the creation of administrative systems that could effectively govern newly compliant worlds without requiring permanent military presence. Horus developed expeditionary strategies that maximized the impact of limited Astartes forces by precisely targeting enemy command structures. Dorn established standardized fortification templates that could be quickly implemented on frontier worlds, creating defensive networks that required minimal garrisons. The Primarch's influence extended beyond their own legions. When multiple legions operated in concert, the Primarch's relationships directly impacted military effectiveness. Some partnerships proved particularly fruitful. Horus and Sanguinius frequently campaigned together, their complementary styles creating an almost unstoppable force. The Khan and Russ, despite their personal differences, developed effective joint tactics that maximized their legion's respective mobility and raw power. Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim formed a close friendship based on mutual respect for their different approaches to perfection, often collaborating on complex compliance actions. Other combinations proved problematic. Angron's uncontrollable aggression made coordinated actions difficult, with his World Eaters often launching premature assaults that disrupted carefully planned operations. Perturabo and Dorn's professional rivalry occasionally undermined joint endeavors, each attempting to prove the superiority of their methods. Kerr's extreme approaches to compliance created tensions when more diplomatic Primarchs like Vulcan were forced to work alongside him. The Emperor's decision to appoint Horus as War Master fundamentally altered these dynamics. While the official explanation emphasized the Emperor's need to return to Terra to work on the Imperial Webway project, the elevation of one Primarch above his brothers created inevitable tensions. Some, like Guilliman and Dorn, accepted the decision with pragmatic understanding. Others, like Angron and Mortarion, viewed it as further evidence of the Emperor's favoritism. Perturabo reportedly received the news in silence before withdrawing to his quarters for a full day. Horus himself approached his new role with a combination of pride and trepidation. While confident in his abilities, he recognized the challenges of commanding his brothers, each a demigod in his own right. His initial approach emphasized collaboration and respect for each Primarch's unique qualities. He assigned campaigns that played to his brothers' strengths: siege operations for Perturabo, rapid response for the Khan, psychological warfare for Kurz, while maintaining strategic oversight of the Crusade's overall direction. This system worked effectively for several years, with the pace of Imperial expansion reaching its peak under Horus's leadership. The War Master's diplomatic skills proved as valuable as his military acumen, allowing him to mediate disputes between his more contentious brothers while maintaining the Crusade's momentum. His ability to synthesize the disparate approaches of the various legions into coherent campaign strategies represented a level of strategic coordination previously unseen. The Primarchs' reunification with their legions represented the fulfillment of the Emperor's original vision for the Great Crusade. These transhuman generals, leading armies created from their own genetic material, formed the spearhead of humanity's reconquest of the galaxy. Their unique abilities, personalities, and relationships created a military force of unprecedented capability, accelerating Imperial expansion far beyond what conventional forces could have achieved. Yet within this success lay the seeds of future catastrophe. The same strong personalities that made the Primarchs effective leaders also made them difficult to control. The varying relationships between the Emperor and his sons created opportunities for resentment and division. The informal hierarchies and rivalries among the brothers established fault lines that could be exploited. As the War Master took command of the Crusade and the Emperor turned his attention to the Webway project, these underlying tensions would continue to develop, ultimately leading to consequences that would reshape the Imperium forever. The Great Crusade's expansion across the galaxy required more than just military might. It demanded sophisticated systems for bringing worlds into the Imperial fold. As the Emperor's forces encountered thousands of human civilizations scattered across the stars, they developed a comprehensive approach to compliance that combined diplomatic persuasion, economic integration, and, when necessary, overwhelming military force. Imperial compliance protocols categorized newly discovered human worlds using a standardized classification system. Worlds designated Gamma level were technologically primitive but compliant, requiring minimal intervention beyond establishing basic Imperial governance. Beta-level worlds possessed moderate technology and required more substantial integration efforts. Alpha-level worlds featured advanced technology or strategic resources that made them high-priority acquisitions. A separate classification, Omega, designated worlds that actively resisted compliance or harbored prohibited technologies, marking them for more aggressive action. The diplomatic approach to compliance centered around the iterators, elite orators trained to present the imperial truth to newly discovered populations. These individuals combined exceptional rhetorical skills with deep knowledge of history, philosophy, and psychology. Iterators deployed to a newly discovered world would study local customs and power structures before crafting persuasive arguments tailored to that specific culture. On worlds with religious traditions, they would systematically deconstruct supernatural beliefs by demonstrating scientific explanations for supposedly divine phenomena. For worlds with tribal or feudal structures, they emphasized the security and prosperity that imperial integration would bring. The most successful iterators became legendary figures within the Crusade. Kyril Sinderman, chief iterator of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, famously convinced the techno-theocracy of Paramur to dismantle their religious institutions voluntarily after a series of public debates that lasted 17 days. On Malech, iterator Euphrates Keeler persuaded the ruling aristocracy that joining the Imperium would enhance rather than diminish their prestige, securing compliance without a single shot fired. These bloodless conquests were celebrated as the ideal fulfillment of the Emperor's vision, human worlds rejoining their species through reason rather than force. Economic integration formed another crucial component of compliance. The Administratum developed standardized procedures for incorporating new worlds into the imperial economic framework. This began with comprehensive resource surveys to identify what the world could contribute to the broader Imperium. Agri-worlds with fertile lands were reorganized to maximize food production, while worlds rich in specific minerals might be developed as mining colonies. Industrial worlds received technology transfers to standardize their manufacturing processes with STC patterns, allowing them to produce equipment compatible with imperial systems. The introduction of imperial currency, standardized across all compliant worlds, facilitated interstellar trade and economic integration. Newly compliant worlds received development loans from the imperial treasury, funding infrastructure projects that connected them to nearby imperial systems. Void stations, mass conveyors, and astropathic relay stations transformed isolated human outposts into functioning nodes within the expanding imperial network. This economic transformation often delivered tangible benefits to local populations, providing powerful evidence of the advantages of imperial membership. For worlds that resisted peaceful compliance, the Imperium maintained a graduated scale of military responses. Initial resistance typically triggered a demonstration of imperial power, perhaps a precision orbital strike against an uninhabited area or a targeted operation against military installations, while leaving civilian infrastructure intact. This approach gave planetary leaders an opportunity to reconsider their opposition without suffering devastating losses. Continued resistance would prompt more substantial military action, with Imperial Army regiments deploying to secure strategic locations, while Space Marine forces neutralized primary defense systems. These operations followed carefully developed templates that minimized civilian casualties while systematically dismantling the planet's ability to resist. The goal remained bringing the world into compliance with its productive capacity and population largely intact, as destroyed worlds contributed nothing to the Imperium's growth. For particularly stubborn or dangerous human civilizations, the Imperium deployed specialized forces known as the Censure Hosts. These formations, drawn from multiple Space Marine legions and supported by elite Imperial Army units, specialized in breaking opponents who had resisted conventional compliance efforts. The Censure Hosts operated with broader authority than standard expeditionary fleets, empowered to make examples of worlds whose defiance might otherwise inspire resistance elsewhere. The most infamous element within these formations was the Destroyer Corps. Destroyer Marines utilized weapons prohibited in normal compliance actions, phosphex, radiation weapons, biological agents, and vortex warheads. Clad in specialized armor with enhanced radiation shielding and atmospheric filters, these warriors brought annihilation to targets deemed too dangerous or corrupted to preserve. Destroyer squads were often drawn from Marines who displayed particular aptitude for total warfare, their psychological profiles showing a detachment that allowed them to employ such devastating weapons without hesitation. The Death Guard Legion maintained the largest destroyer contingents, their natural resilience making them particularly suited to operating amidst the toxic aftermath of such weapons. The World Eaters and Iron Warriors also fielded substantial destroyer units, deployed when compliance required complete eradication rather than integration. These forces operated under strict protocols. Their deployment required authorization from a Lord Commander or Primarch, and their weapons remained secured in specialized armories when not in active use. The compliance of Melchior exemplified the destroyer's role within the Crusade. When Imperial forces discovered that this human world had integrated alien technology directly into their governance systems, allowing non-human entities to participate in decision-making, the response was uncompromising. After a single demand for surrender was rejected, destroyer squads from the 13th Legion deployed across the planet's major population centers. Within 6 hours, the world's leadership was eliminated, and its alien-influenced infrastructure reduced to radioactive slag. The surviving human population received a stark education in the Emperor's policy toward Xeno's collaboration, with the planet's reconstruction explicitly designed to erase all evidence of its former culture. Beyond the military aspects of compliance, the implementation of the Imperial Truth represented perhaps the most profound transformation imposed on newly integrated worlds. This philosophical framework, developed by the Emperor himself, provided the ideological foundation for the entire Imperium. At its core, the Imperial Truth promoted rational materialism, the belief that the universe operated according to natural laws that could be understood through observation and reason. It explicitly rejected religion, superstition, and the supernatural, categorizing such beliefs as obstacles to human progress. The implementation of the Imperial Truth varied based on a world's existing cultural framework. On planets with strong scientific traditions, the transition might be relatively seamless, requiring only minor adjustments to align with Imperial terminology and standards. For worlds dominated by religious institutions, the process proved far more disruptive, often requiring the complete dismantling of priesthoods and theological hierarchies. The compliance of Davin illustrated the challenges of implementing the Imperial Truth on a deeply religious world. When the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet brought this feudal planet to compliance, they encountered a population steeped in animistic worship and tribal rituals. Rather than immediately suppressing these practices, the compliance team initially allowed them to continue while establishing Imperial infrastructure and education systems. This gradualist approach aimed to replace superstition with rational understanding over time, avoiding the resistance that more abrupt measures might provoke. In contrast, when the Word-Bearers Legion encountered the theocracy of 4716, their approach was far more direct. Under Primarch Lorgar's direction, they systematically destroyed every religious structure on the planet, executed the entire priestly caste, and instituted mandatory education in the Imperial Truth for the surviving population. This heavy-handed implementation completed in weeks what might otherwise have taken decades, though at the cost of significant cultural trauma and lingering resentment. The Emperor's stance on religious suppression contained nuance often overlooked by overzealous compliance officers. While he firmly opposed worship directed at supernatural entities, particularly after witnessing how such beliefs could empower warp entities, he recognized that abruptly stripping populations of deep-seated cultural practices could create dangerous instability. The official compliance doctrine that emerged recommended a phased approach, first redirecting religious devotion toward reverence for human achievement, then gradually introducing scientific explanations for natural phenomena, and finally establishing purely rational frameworks for understanding the universe. This approach proved particularly effective on Mars, where the Emperor pragmatically allowed the Mechanicum to maintain their religious traditions while reframing them to serve Imperial purposes. The machine cult's veneration of technology continued, but with the Emperor positioned as the Omnissiah, the physical manifestation of their machine god. This compromise secured the vital technological resources of Mars without triggering destructive religious conflict, demonstrating the Emperor's willingness to adapt ideological purity to practical necessity when required. The establishment of governance systems on newly compliant worlds followed similarly pragmatic principles. Rather than imposing a single administrative template across all worlds, Imperial compliance protocols adapted to existing power structures when possible. Planets with functional governments that accepted Imperial authority might retain much of their original leadership, with an Imperial commander appointed to oversee compliance with broader Imperial directives. Worlds with incompatible governance systems underwent more substantial restructuring, with Imperial administrators directly implementing new governmental frameworks. The Ultramarines under Robute Guilliman pioneered many of the most effective governance models. The Ultramar system, with its balance between centralized authority and local autonomy, became a template frequently adapted for newly compliant worlds. Guilliman's administrators established tiered governance structures with clear lines of authority, standardized taxation systems that funded both local development and Imperial tithes, and educational institutions that promoted both practical skills and ideological alignment with the Imperial Truth. Compliance officers recognized that effective governance required more than just administrative structures. It needed human capital. The identification and development of local leadership became a crucial aspect of successful integration. Imperial educational facilities established on newly compliant worlds specifically targeted promising individuals for advanced training, creating a cadre of local administrators who understood both Imperial requirements and local conditions. This approach accelerated integration while reducing dependence on imported administrators who might lack cultural context. The 28th Expeditionary Fleet, operating primarily in the Segmentum Tempestus, became particularly adept at this approach. Under Lord Commander Valen, they developed a standardized process for identifying local leadership talent during initial compliance assessments. Selected individuals received immediate training in Imperial protocols while retaining their positions within local power structures, creating a bridge between Imperial authority and native populations. This method reduced compliance costs by an estimated 40%, while decreasing the incidence of post-compliance rebellions by over 60%. The economic transformation of newly compliant worlds often proved as challenging as their cultural and political integration. Imperial compliance required standardization across numerous domains, currency, weights and measures, technical specifications, legal codes, and trade regulations. This standardization facilitated interstellar commerce and administrative efficiency, but imposed significant adjustment costs on local economies. To manage this transition, expeditionary fleets typically deployed economic transition teams alongside their military and diplomatic personnel. These specialists assessed local economic systems and developed phased implementation plans for Imperial standards. Transition periods might last from several months to several years, depending on the world's technological level and economic complexity. During this time, Imperial currency would circulate alongside local money, dual measurement systems would be permitted, and tariff exemptions might ease the integration into broader Imperial trade networks. The most successful compliance operations recognized that effective integration required balance between standardization and local adaptation. Worlds brought into compliance by the Ultramarines typically retained distinctive cultural elements that posed no threat to Imperial authority, preserving local identities while ensuring absolute loyalty to the broader Imperium. In contrast, the Iron Warriors' approach to compliance often emphasized rigid conformity, replacing local variations with standardized Imperial templates regardless of cultural context. Both methods produced compliant worlds, but the former typically required less ongoing enforcement while generating greater productivity and fewer rebellions. As the Great Crusade progressed, these instruments of compliance evolved through practical experience. Early approaches that proved counterproductive were refined or abandoned, while successful methods were codified and disseminated across expeditionary fleets. This institutional learning process transformed compliance from an improvised series of conquests into a sophisticated system for expanding and consolidating imperial rule. The diplomatic, economic, and military instruments of compliance represented the practical application of the emperor's vision, the methodical reunification of humanity under a single authority capable of ensuring the species' survival and advancement. While individual compliance actions might employ different balances of persuasion and force, all served the fundamental goal of creating an imperium where humanity stood united against the myriad threats of a hostile galaxy. The Great Crusade encountered countless alien civilizations as humanity pushed outward from Terra. While the Emperor's primary focus remained the reunification of scattered human worlds, the extermination of Xeno's species became an equally important objective. Humanity had suffered grievously at alien hands during the Age of Strife, with countless human colonies enslaved, exploited, or destroyed by opportunistic Xenos who took advantage of mankind's isolation. The Emperor's policy was clear. The galaxy belonged to humanity, and Xenos posed an existential threat that could not be tolerated. Among the most widespread and dangerous alien threats encountered during the Crusade were the Orcs. These green-skinned warriors had established dozens of pocket empires throughout the galaxy, particularly in the Segmentum Solar and Ultima Segmentum. Unlike many Xeno species that the Imperium would face, the Orcs represented a foe that could match humanity's expansion in both numbers and aggression. Their biology made them formidable opponents, able to survive grievous injuries, reproduce through fungal spores, and instinctively create technology from seemingly random components. The Ulanor Crusade stood as the most significant campaign against the Greenskins. An enormous Orc empire had risen under the leadership of Warlord Erlak Erg, threatening to consolidate Orc power across an entire sector. The Emperor himself led this campaign, accompanied by Horus, Mortarion, and elements from several other legions. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, with over 100,000 Space Marines deployed alongside millions of Imperial Army troops and thousands of Mechanicum war engines. The strategy employed at Ulanor demonstrated the Imperium's growing sophistication in combating Orc physiology and culture. Rather than engaging in protracted battles of attrition, Imperial forces conducted precision decapitation strikes against the Orc leadership. Recognizing the Greenskins' hierarchical nature, the Emperor and his Primarchs personally led assaults on Erlak Erg's command centers. The Emperor's own attack on the Warlord's Fortress Temple saw him teleport directly into the heart of the Orc command structure, with a contingent of custodians, cutting through hundreds of elite Orc guards before slaying Erlak Erg in single combat. With their leadership eliminated, the Orc forces fragmented into competing factions, allowing Imperial forces to defeat them piecemeal. The campaign highlighted a fundamental Imperial insight into Orc psychology. Without strong leadership to unite them, Orc empires inevitably collapsed into internal conflict. This understanding informed future anti-Orc operations, with targeted assassinations and decapitation strikes becoming standard procedure when facing Greenskin empires. While the Ulanor Crusade represented the most celebrated victory against the Orcs, countless smaller campaigns were waged against Greenskin-held territories throughout the Great Crusade. The White Scars became particularly adept at combating Orc expansion through their doctrine of swift, mobile warfare. Under Jagatai Khan, the 5th Legion developed specialized tactics that exploited the Orcs' relatively slow response to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. White Scars strike forces would isolate Orc concentrations, sever their supply lines, and eliminate their leadership before the Greenskins could mount an effective defense. The Space Wolves similarly earned renown for their anti-Orc operations, though their approach contrasted sharply with the White Scars' mobility doctrine. Leman Russ favored direct confrontation, meeting Orc ferocity with equal savagery. The 6th Legion's Berserker counter-assault tactics proved remarkably effective against Orc psychology, as the Greenskins' respect for strength often led them to fixate on Space Wolf assault units, allowing other Imperial forces to outflank and encircle the distracted Orcs. While the Orcs represented a persistent and widespread threat, the most dangerous Xenos encountered during the Great Crusade were arguably the Rangdan. The Rangdan genocides stand as some of the most devastating campaigns of the era, yet details remain heavily redacted in Imperial records. What information survives indicates that the Rangdan were a highly advanced species with technology that could corrupt and subvert human biology, turning Imperial citizens and even space marines into thralls under Rangdan control. The first Rangdan genocide began in the early years of the Crusade, when Expedition Fleet 156 encountered the first Rangdan Cerebror outbreaks on the fringes of the Halo stars. The Dark Angels, led by Lionel Johnson, formed the primary Imperial response, with the First Legion committing nearly its entire strength to containing the Rangdan advance. The fighting lasted nearly a decade, with the Dark Angels suffering casualties so severe that their position as the largest legion was permanently ceded to the Ultramarines. The second and third Rangdan genocides required even more drastic measures. The Emperor dispatched several Primarchs to the front, including Horus, Mortarion, and Jagatai Khan. Most ominously, records indicate that the Emperor authorized the deployment of assets from the Vault of Moravik, prohibited weapons technologies from the Dark Age that had been sealed away due to their extreme danger. The Mechanicum fielded experimental weapons platforms, while specialized Titan configurations, designed specifically for the Rangdan threat, emerged from Mars' most secretive forges. The final defeat of the Rangdan came at an appalling cost. Entire expedition fleets were lost without trace. At least one Space Marine Legion suffered casualties, approaching 90% of its fighting strength, requiring extensive rebuilding. Several frontier sectors underwent mandatory population purges to eliminate suspected Rangdan contamination, resulting in the deaths of billions of Imperial citizens. The threat was deemed so severe that even after the genocides concluded, a permanent quarantine zone was established around the remaining Rangdan spheres of influence, patrolled by dedicated Dark Angels fleets. The Imperium's approach to Xeno's threats varied based on the nature of the species encountered. Some, like the Orcs and Rangdan, represented immediate military threats requiring full-scale mobilization. Others posed more insidious dangers through cultural or technological contamination. The Quorl Swarmhood, encountered in the Segmentum Pacificus, initially appeared to be confined to a single star system, but was discovered to have planted sleeper agents on dozens of human worlds. The Imperial response involved not just military action against the Quorl homeworlds, but extensive purges of potentially compromised human populations. The Crave presented a different type of threat. These psychic parasites could assume control of human hosts while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Several early compliance operations were compromised when Crave-infected planetary leaders accepted Imperial rule while secretly working to subvert Imperial forces. After several such incidents, standard compliance protocols were updated to include mandatory psychic screening of all planetary leadership before formal integration into the Imperium. Not all xenospecies encountered during the Great Crusade were hostile. The Diasporex, a nomadic civilization comprising both humans and aliens living in fleet-based harmony, sought only to continue their peaceful existence. The Imperium's response illustrated the absolutist nature of its xenocidal policy. Despite the Diasporex's non-aggressive stance, they were targeted for destruction solely because humans lived alongside aliens as equals. The Iron Hands and Emperor's Children legions jointly prosecuted this campaign, systematically destroying the Diasporex vessels until none remained. The Adarnian civilization similarly posed no military threat to Imperial expansion. These crystalline beings inhabited a cluster of worlds rich in rare minerals, but showed no interest in conflict when Imperial expeditions arrived. Nevertheless, the 11th Expeditionary Fleet, supported by elements of the Iron Warriors, systematically eradicated the Adarnians and their settlements to secure the mineral wealth of their worlds. The campaign was conducted with clinical efficiency, with after-action reports focusing primarily on resource extraction projections rather than the species that had been removed to facilitate them. This ruthless approach to even peaceful xenospecies stemmed from the Emperor's experience during the Age of Strife. Humanity had learned through bitter experience that coexistence with alien civilizations inevitably led to exploitation when human power waned. The Imperial Truth taught that the galaxy's resources were finite, and competition between species was inevitable. Such a zero-sum environment, allowing any Xeno civilization to persist, represented a potential future threat to human survival. The justification for xenocide became codified in imperial doctrine through the Principles of Ascendancy, a document attributed to Malcador the Sigillite that outlined the philosophical foundation for human dominance. It argued that humanity's destiny as the galaxy's dominant species was not merely a matter of preference, but of existential necessity. The document detailed historical examples of Xeno's betrayal during the Age of Strife, cataloging thousands of human worlds that had fallen to alien predation when warp storms isolated them from Terra's protection. Different Space Marine legions developed specialized approaches to combating specific Xeno's threats. The Ultramarines created dedicated tactical protocols for major Xeno species, with formations trained specifically for anti-Orc, anti-Eldari, or anti-Sloth operations. These protocols included specialized equipment loadouts, formation compositions, and battlefield doctrines tailored to exploit the weaknesses of particular alien physiologies and psychologies. The Death Guard excelled at warfare against Xenos that relied on biological weapons or inhabited toxic environments. Mortarian sons could operate in conditions that would kill even other Space Marines, allowing them to pursue retreating Xenos into environments the aliens believed would provide safe haven. During the purge of the Jorgal enclaves in the Kenath cluster, Death Guard forces followed the retreating aliens into ammonia-rich atmospheres that would have been instantly fatal to unprotected humans, systematically eliminating the Xenos in environments they had considered secure. The Night Lords specialized in psychological warfare against sentient Xenos. Conrad Kerr's legion studied alien thought patterns and cultural taboos, then weaponized this knowledge to maximize terror. When facing the avian Nephilim, Night Lords forces deliberately targeted nesting sites and violated reproductive rituals, actions that had devastating psychological impacts beyond their tactical significance. The resulting psychological collapse often led to mass surrenders or suicides, greatly accelerating the xenocide process. The Alpha Legion developed perhaps the most sophisticated approach to Xeno's elimination. Rather than direct military confrontation, Alfarius's warriors infiltrated alien societies, identified structural weaknesses, and engineered internal conflicts. During the purge of the Carinid Federation, Alpha Legion operatives manipulated rival factions into a devastating civil war that consumed much of the species' military strength before Imperial forces even engaged. When the Imperium finally attacked, the weakened and divided Carinids were eliminated with minimal Imperial casualties. These specialized approaches to xenocide reflected the Imperium's growing understanding of alien psychology and biology. Early Crusade operations often relied on overwhelming force applied indiscriminately, but as the Imperium encountered more diverse Xeno civilizations, its methods became increasingly targeted and efficient. This evolution represented not a softening of the Imperium's xenocidal policy, but its refinement into a more effective implementation. The long-term consequences of the Imperium's xenocidal campaigns transformed the galactic ecosystem. Entire species that had evolved over millions of years were eliminated in campaigns lasting mere months. Worlds that had hosted diverse alien biospheres were sterilized and repopulated with Terran-compatible life forms. The deliberate extinction of countless species represented an irreversible reduction in galactic biodiversity, the full implications of which would not become apparent for millennia. Some within the Mechanicum recognized the potential loss of valuable biological and technological knowledge represented by these extinctions. Magos Biologa's other Tiberius famously petitioned for the establishment of xenobiological preserves, where non-sentient alien life forms could be studied rather than eliminated. His request was denied, and Tiberius himself was later investigated for tech heresy, his ultimate fate redacted from imperial records. The extermination of psychic species had particularly profound effects on the warp. Many ancient Xeno civilizations had developed sophisticated understandings of the immaterium and established warp-based technologies or practices that maintained local stability. Their elimination sometimes resulted in increased warp turbulence in regions where they had once provided a calming influence. In the Perseus arm, the eradication of the Cethelian mind choirs was followed by a measurable increase in warp storms throughout the sector, forcing the rerouting of several major Imperial shipping lanes. The Great Crusade stands as perhaps the most significant military campaign of the Great Crusade before the Horus Heresy. What began as yet another operation against an expanding Xenos empire quickly revealed itself as something far more dangerous, the largest and most advanced Orc empire encountered by Imperial forces since leaving Terra. Intelligence reports from Mechanicum exploration vessels and Imperial Army Scout units painted an alarming picture. Dozens of star systems under Orc control, with hundreds of worlds serving as recruitment grounds for an ever-growing greenskin horde. At the heart of this empire stood Warlord Erlak Erg, a beast of terrifying proportions and cunning intellect by Orc standards. Unlike the fractious and disorganized Orc forces encountered elsewhere, Erlak had managed to unite countless tribes under his iron-fisted rule. More concerning still, Mechanicum assessments of captured Orc technology indicated a rapid advancement in their war machines. The Greenskins were developing weapons and vehicles of increasing sophistication, suggesting that Erlak's empire had reached the dangerous tipping point where Orc technological evolution accelerates exponentially. The strategic implications were clear and dire. Left unchecked, this Orc empire would continue to expand, potentially reaching a critical mass that could threaten even heavily fortified Imperial sectors. The Emperor himself recognized the existential threat this posed and declared the Ulanor campaign a priority that would draw resources from across the Imperium. The resulting military buildup was unprecedented. 16 Space Marine legions contributed forces, with the Sons of Horus, Luna Wolves, White Scars, and Ultramarines providing the largest contingents. Horus, already established as the Emperor's most trusted general, worked closely with his father to develop the campaign strategy. Their approach demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Orc psychology and social structure. Rather than engaging in a war of attrition across hundreds of worlds, they designed a series of lightning strikes aimed at decapitating the Orc leadership structure, knowing that without strong leadership, the Greenskin Empire would collapse into infighting. The initial phase of the campaign targeted outlying systems, with Space Marine strike forces eliminating local Orc warbosses and destroying their primary manufacturing centers. The White Scars excelled in these operations, their swift hit-and-run tactics perfectly suited to creating confusion among Orc forces. Jagatai Khan's warriors would strike without warning, eliminating key targets before vanishing into the void, leaving the Orcs to turn on each other in the resulting power vacuum. As these peripheral operations drew Orc reinforcements away from their core worlds, Horus led the main Imperial force in a direct assault on Ulanor itself, the throne world of Erlak Erg. The approach to the Ulanor system was a masterpiece of void warfare. Navigators plotted courses that brought the Imperial fleet out of the warp in perfect attack formation, while specialized electronic warfare units from the Mechanicum blinded Orc early warning systems. The Greenskins' sizable orbital defenses found themselves engaging phantom targets as Imperial ships slipped through their defensive grid. The ground war on Ulanor demonstrated Horus's tactical brilliance at its finest. Rather than committing to a broad front advance across the Orc-held continents, he identified key strategic nodes whose capture would paralyze the Greenskin command structure. Drop pods and assault craft delivered precision strikes by Space Marine elite units, securing landing zones for the broader Imperial forces that followed. Mechanicum Titan legions deployed in unprecedented numbers, with over 100 war machines walking the surface of Ulanor at the campaign's peak. The Emperor himself led the final assault on Erlak's fortress city, a sprawling complex of crude but effective defenses centered around a massive tower of scavenged metal and machinery. Accompanied by a contingent of custodians and the elite Terminator companies of the Sons of Horus, the Master of Mankind teleported directly into the heart of the Orc stronghold. Survivors of this assault spoke of the Emperor moving through the Orc defenders like a golden whirlwind, his flaming sword cutting down greenskins by the dozens with each swing. The confrontation between the Emperor and Erlak Erg became the stuff of Imperial legend. The Orc warlord towered even over the Primarchs, his body augmented with crude bionics that increased his already formidable strength. Accounts describe a battle that shook the foundations of the fortress, with each blow from the Emperor's sword cleaving through Erlak's armored hide, while the warlord's massive power claw tore chunks from the surrounding architecture. In the end, the Emperor struck a killing blow that not only ended Erlak's life, but allegedly sent a psychic shockwave through the Orc forces across the planet, momentarily stunning them and allowing Imperial forces to press their advantage. With their supreme leader fallen, the Orc Empire's cohesion shattered. Subordinate warbosses immediately began fighting amongst themselves for dominance, turning their weapons on each other rather than the Imperial forces. Horus exploited this disarray masterfully, directing targeted strikes against emerging Orc leaders before they could consolidate power. Within weeks, what had been the most dangerous Xenos empire in the galaxy had devolved into hundreds of warring factions, each too concerned with local dominance to mount an effective resistance against the Imperium. The military significance of the Ulanor victory cannot be overstated. The campaign eliminated a threat that could have potentially halted the Great Crusade's momentum and forced the Imperium into a defensive posture. It secured hundreds of worlds for Imperial compliance and freed dozens of expedition fleets to resume their original missions. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that even the most formidable Xenos empires could not stand against the combined might of humanity when led by the Emperor and his Primarchs. Beyond its immediate strategic impact, the Ulanor Crusade became a watershed moment in Imperial history for another reason entirely: the grand triumph and the momentous decisions that followed. With the military campaign concluded, the Emperor declared that such a significant victory deserved commemoration on a scale befitting its importance. Imperial forces constructed a massive parade ground on the former site of Erlak's fortress, transforming the battlefield into a stage for what would become known as the Triumph of Ulanor. The triumph represented the high watermark of the Great Crusade, a moment when the Emperor's vision seemed fully realized and the future of humanity appeared bright with promise. Nearly all the Primarchs attended, with only a few absent due to campaigns too distant or critical to abandon. Over 100,000 Space Marines stood in perfect formation, their armor gleaming in the sun of Ulanor. Mechanicum Titans lined the parade grounds, while Imperial Army regiments stretched to the horizon. Newly compliant human worlds sent representatives to witness the spectacle, many seeing the Emperor in person for the first time. The ceremony began with a procession of the Primarchs, each accompanied by honor guards from their respective legions. The assembled forces and spectators witnessed the full majesty of the Emperor's transhuman sons gathered together, a sight few would ever see again. The diversity of the Primarchs was on full display: the noble bearing of Sanguinius with his magnificent wings, the stoic presence of Rogel Dorn, the cold efficiency of Lionel Johnson, the calculating intelligence of Robute Gilliman, and the savage power of Leman Russ. The Emperor addressed the assembled forces from a specially constructed dais, his psychic presence amplifying his words so that even those at the farthest edges of the gathering could hear him clearly. He spoke of humanity's destiny among the stars, of the Great Crusade's purpose in reuniting the scattered fragments of mankind, and of the Imperial Truth that would guide humanity away from the superstition and ignorance that had characterized the Age of Strife. To many present, it seemed the culmination of all they had fought for, visible proof that the Emperor's grand vision was becoming reality. What followed, however, would change the course of the Crusade forever. The Emperor announced his intention to return to Terra, explaining that matters of great importance required his personal attention. While he did not elaborate on the nature of this work, later events would reveal it to be the Imperial Webway Project, an attempt to create a human-controlled network of webway passages that would free mankind from dependence on warp travel. This announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the gathering, as many had assumed the Emperor would continue to lead the crusade personally until its completion. More shocking still was his next proclamation. Stepping forward, the emperor designated Horus as War Master, supreme commander of all imperial military forces. This elevation placed one Primarch above his brothers, granting Horus authority over not just his own legion, but all imperial military assets. The emperor presented Horus with new regalia signifying his rank, including a unique suit of armor that incorporated elements from all the legions, symbolizing his authority over the entire imperial war machine. The reactions among the Primarchs to this announcement varied widely. Some, like Sanguinius and Fulgrim, openly celebrated Horus's elevation, considering it a worthy recognition of his accomplishments. Others, particularly Angron and Perturabo, displayed visible discontent, perhaps seeing it as evidence of favoritism. Most maintained carefully neutral expressions, their true thoughts hidden behind masks of transhuman control. Rogel Dorn, notably, was among the first to kneel before the newly named War Master, his gesture of submission setting an example for others to follow. Horus himself appeared momentarily taken aback by the announcement before composing himself and accepting the honor with characteristic eloquence. Those close to the War Master would later report that his reaction in private was more complex. Pride in his father's trust mixed with concern about commanding his brother Primarchs and uncertainty about the Emperor's true reasons for returning to Terra. Nevertheless, he embraced his new role publicly, vowing to continue the Great Crusade in accordance with the Emperor's vision. The Emperor's decision to return to Terra, while elevating Horus to War Master, had profound psychological impacts on the Primarchs. For many, it represented an unexpected shift in the fundamental structure of the Imperium they had helped build. Some interpreted the Emperor's departure as abandonment, a father leaving his sons to pursue interests more important than their shared conquest of the galaxy. Others saw it as a natural evolution, recognizing that the Imperium had grown too vast for even the Emperor to oversee directly. Perturabo reportedly remarked to his inner circle that the Emperor's return to Terra confirmed what he had long suspected, that the Primarchs were tools to be used and set aside when more important matters arose. Mortarion, already harboring resentment over the Emperor's handling of his homeworld Barbarus, viewed the decision as further evidence of the Emperor's capricious nature. Even loyal sons like Rogel Dorn and Robute Guilliman privately questioned the timing of the Emperor's withdrawal from the Crusade. For Horus, the Emperor's departure created both opportunity and immense pressure. While he had effectively commanded multi-legion operations before, formal authority over his brothers represented a fundamentally different challenge. The Primarchs were not merely military commanders, but demigod-like beings with their own ambitions, philosophies, and fierce pride. Managing these transhuman egos would require diplomatic skills as refined as Horus's military acumen. In the immediate aftermath of the triumph, Horus began restructuring the command protocols of the Great Crusade to accommodate his new role. He established the Council of Terra to manage the Imperium's administrative functions, while creating a separate War Master's Council for military oversight. He assigned specific sectors and campaign theaters to Primarchs based on their legion's strengths, sending Perturabo's Iron Warriors to siege operations, deploying the Night Lords to terror campaigns against particularly resistant human worlds, and directing the Ultramarines to stabilize newly compliant regions. The Emperor's return to Terra coincided with significant administrative changes in the Imperium structure. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, began establishing new bureaucratic institutions to manage the rapidly expanding Imperium. The Council of Terra, initially conceived as a temporary measure during the Emperor's absence, evolved into a permanent governing body with authority over non-military imperial affairs. This separation of military and civilian authority represented a fundamental shift from the more unified command structure that had characterized the early Crusade. Some Primarchs, particularly those like Angron and Mortarion who had little interest in governance, paid scant attention to these administrative changes. Others, especially Guilliman and Dorn with their interest in statecraft, recognized the long-term implications of creating separate military and civilian hierarchies. Lorgar of the Word-Bearers reportedly expressed concern that dividing authority in this manner risked creating competing power centers within the Imperium, a prescient observation given later developments. The Emperor's focus after returning to Terra remained largely mysterious to even his sons. Communications from the throne world became increasingly infrequent and formal, often relayed through Malcador rather than directly from the Emperor himself. The Imperial Palace underwent massive expansion, with entire sections declared off-limits to all but the Emperor's most trusted servants. Rumors spread of strange energies detected in the palace's foundations and of mysterious artifacts being transported to Terra from distant worlds. For the Primarchs scattered across the galaxy continuing the Great Crusade, this silence from their father created a growing sense of distance. Where once they had been able to seek the Emperor's counsel directly, now they found themselves dealing with representatives who lacked his authority and insight. This communication gap would later prove critical, as misunderstandings and resentments festered without the Emperor's presence to address them. Horus worked diligently to fill the void left by the Emperor's absence, traveling extensively to coordinate with his brothers and personally oversee critical campaigns. His diplomatic skills proved as valuable as his military genius, as he managed the complex relationships between Primarchs with often conflicting personalities and approaches. When the headstrong Leman Russ clashed with the contemplative Magnus over the use of psychic powers, it was Horus who brokered a temporary accommodation. When Angron's excessive brutality threatened compliance efforts in the Gehenna campaign, Horus personally intervened to redirect the World Eaters toward targets where their savagery would be an asset rather than a liability. Despite these efforts, the fundamental change in the Imperium's power structure following Ulanor created fault lines that would eventually contribute to the heresy. The Emperor's decision to elevate one son above the others, combined with his withdrawal to Terra for purposes not fully explained even to the Primarchs, planted seeds of doubt and resentment. The triumph of Ulanor, intended to celebrate humanity's greatest victory, inadvertently set in motion events that would lead to its greatest tragedy. The immediate aftermath of Ulanor, however, saw the Great Crusade continue with renewed vigor under Horus's direction. With the Orc Empire shattered and Imperial forces freed for new conquests, the pace of expansion accelerated. The newly appointed War Master proved worthy of his title, coordinating campaigns across thousands of light years with remarkable effectiveness. For a time, it seemed the Emperor's decision had been prescient. Horus appeared to be the perfect choice to lead humanity's armies, while the Master of Mankind attended to matters on Terra. The Great Crusade reached its zenith during the years following the triumph of Ulanor. With Horus elevated to War Master and the Emperor returned to Terra, the Imperium's expansion accelerated to an unprecedented pace. Nearly 1 million worlds acknowledged Imperial authority, with hundreds more being added each year. This vast domain stretched across 5 segmentums, encompassing countless human civilizations that had developed in isolation during the Age of Strife. The scale of conquest dwarfed any empire in human history, creating logistical and administrative challenges that would have been insurmountable without the infrastructure established during the Crusade's earlier phases. The rate of expansion during this period was staggering. Statistical analyses conducted by the Mechanicum's Divisio Logis estimated that Imperial territory grew by approximately 11% annually in the 5 years following Ulanor. Individual expeditionary fleets claimed dozens of systems per standard year, with the most successful bringing over 100 worlds to compliance annually. Guilliman's Ultramarines were particularly prolific, with the 13th Legion's methodical approach allowing them to secure and stabilize new territories with remarkable efficiency. Their campaigns in the Segmentum Tempestus added over 500 habitable worlds to the Imperium in less than a decade. This rapid expansion was made possible by the increasingly sophisticated logistical networks supporting the expeditionary fleets. The Mechanicum established standardized supply chains that extended tens of thousands of light years from Terra, with strategically positioned forge worlds producing the ammunition, replacement parts, and equipment needed to sustain operations on the frontier. Massive fleet tenders accompanied the warships, carrying enough supplies to maintain campaign momentum for years without returning to established Imperial territory. Specialized astropathic relay stations formed a communication grid that, while still subject to the vagaries of the warp, provided reasonably reliable contact between distant fleets and command centers. The Adeptus Munitorum, which had begun as a relatively small organization coordinating supplies for the early Crusade fleets, evolved into a vast bureaucracy with offices on thousands of worlds. Munitorum logisticians developed increasingly sophisticated methods for calculating resource requirements and distribution patterns, allowing them to anticipate the needs of far-flung expeditionary fleets months or even years in advance. Standardized equipment templates ensured that weapons and vehicles produced on distant forge worlds would be compatible with those manufactured in the Sol system, creating interchangeable parts that simplified maintenance and repairs. Transport networks became increasingly formalized during this period. Major warp routes were mapped and classified according to their reliability and transit times. Primary arterials connected the most significant Imperial worlds, with scheduled convoy movements ensuring regular supply deliveries. Secondary routes linked smaller systems to these main thoroughfares, while tertiary pathways served frontier regions where warp conditions remained less predictable. Naval assets were strategically positioned along these routes to respond to threats, with rapid reaction forces stationed at major junction points. The administrative challenges of governing such a vast domain led to significant developments in Imperial bureaucracy. The Council of Terra, established by Malcador the Sigillite, evolved from an advisory body into the primary civilian authority for the Imperium. The council comprised representatives from major Imperial institutions, including the Administratum, the Mechanicum, and the nascent Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Their responsibilities encompassed everything from taxation and resource allocation to legal codification and compliance monitoring. The Administratum itself grew exponentially, developing specialized departments to handle specific aspects of Imperial governance. The Adeptus Exacta managed census data and population records, while the Officio Fiscalis oversaw taxation and treasury functions. The Divisio Historica documented compliance actions and maintained records of newly integrated worlds. These bureaucratic structures, initially designed to be efficient and responsive, would eventually calcify into the labyrinthine organization known to later millennia, but during the Crusades' height, they operated with relative effectiveness. Planetary governance followed standardized templates adapted to local conditions. Newly compliant worlds typically received an Imperial commander selected either from local leadership or appointed from experienced administratum officials. These commanders were supported by a staff of specialists who implemented Imperial institutions while respecting local customs that didn't conflict with Imperial policy. The goal was integration that minimized disruption while ensuring absolute loyalty to Terra. The Mechanicum played a crucial role in this administrative framework, providing the technological infrastructure that made interstellar governance possible. Cogitator networks maintained by tech priests processed the vast amounts of data generated by Imperial operations, while standardized Vox and astropathic communication protocols enabled information exchange across thousands of light years. Mechanicum survey teams assessed newly compliant worlds, cataloging resources and identifying potential sites for industrial development. Despite these sophisticated systems, the sheer scale of the Imperium inevitably created administrative challenges. Even with astropathic communication, information could take months to travel between distant sectors. Local authorities necessarily exercised considerable autonomy, interpreting broad Imperial directives according to their understanding and circumstances. This decentralization was both a strength and weakness, allowing flexibility in addressing local conditions, but creating potential for divergence from central policy. The most distant expeditions of this period pushed into regions previously considered beyond practical reach. The Ghoul Stars, a region in the galactic northeast notorious for strange phenomena and hostile xeno species, saw multiple Imperial expeditions penetrate its borders. The 9th Expeditionary Fleet, comprising elements of the Dark Angels and Imperial Fists, established several fortified outposts along the region's edge, creating staging areas for deeper exploration. These footholds remained tenuous, with several lost to unknown threats that emerged from the region's depths. The halo zone at the galaxy's outer edge presented different challenges. Here, stellar density decreased dramatically, with inhabited systems separated by vast empty regions. Expeditionary fleets operating in this region required specialized support vessels with extended range and endurance. The White Scars proved particularly effective in this environment, their preference for mobility and self-sufficiency well suited to operations far from supply bases. Jagatai Khan personally led several expeditions into the Halo Zone, establishing the furthest permanent Imperial outposts nearly 5,000 light-years beyond what had previously been considered the practical frontier. These frontier expeditions encountered phenomena and entities unlike those in more densely populated galactic regions. The Halo Zone contained stellar anomalies that defied conventional astronomical understanding, while the Ghoul stars harbored xeno-civilizations with biology and technology that seemed to violate natural laws. Mechanicum explorators documented worlds where reality itself appeared unstable, with physical constants shifting unpredictably. Many of these discoveries were classified by direct order from Terra, with exploration records sealed in the most secure Imperial archives. The Death Guard ventured into the galactic south, where they discovered several human civilizations that had developed in complete isolation since the Dark Age of technology. These Sarkassan cultures had evolved distinct technological paths, creating devices that achieved similar functions to Imperial technology through entirely different mechanisms. Mortarion ordered comprehensive studies of these civilizations before bringing them to compliance, recognizing the potential value in their alternative technological approaches. The Mechanicum established several research facilities in the region, though their findings remain largely classified. The Ultramarines pushed eastward into what would later be designated Ultramar Segmentum, encountering the densest concentration of habitable worlds discovered during the Crusade. Guilliman's methodical approach proved perfectly suited to this region, where hundreds of human worlds existed in relatively close proximity. Rather than simply securing compliance and moving on, the Ultramarines established lasting governmental structures that linked these worlds into mutually supportive networks. This approach laid the foundation for what would eventually become the realm of Ultramar, though during the Crusade it remained fully integrated with broader Imperial administration. The Alpha Legion operated primarily in the Galactic West, where they encountered the remnants of several ancient human empires that had maintained interstellar travel throughout the Age of Strife. These civilizations possessed technological capabilities that rivaled Imperial standards in some areas, making conventional compliance approaches potentially costly. Alfarius developed subtle methods for infiltrating and subverting these societies from within, often achieving compliance without overt military action. The full details of these operations remain obscured, as the Alpha Legion's methods typically eliminated evidence of their involvement. The Word-Bearers, having recovered from their censure at Monarchia, conducted extensive operations in the galactic northwest. Lorgar's Legion focused particularly on worlds with deeply entrenched religious traditions, applying their experience in cultural transformation to replace local faiths with devotion to the Imperial Truth. Their compliance actions were thorough and methodical, leaving behind populations thoroughly indoctrinated in Imperial ideology. Unknown to Imperial authorities, however, these later compliance actions increasingly incorporated subtle elements of chaos worship disguised as Imperial ritual. The logistical demands of supporting these far-flung expeditions required innovations in supply chain management. The Mechanicum developed specialized warp-capable cargo vessels designed specifically for long-duration support missions. These ships, designated longevous pattern supply haulers, carried modular cargo sections that could be detached and left at forward bases while the main vessel continued to other destinations. This system allowed a single supply ship to service multiple expeditionary fleets on a single voyage, dramatically improving efficiency. fuel represented a particular challenge for distant operations. While most Imperial vessels could operate for years between major refueling, sustained high-energy operations depleted reserves more quickly. The Mechanicum established automated harvesting stations around gas giants in key frontier systems, creating refueling points that required minimal personnel to maintain. These stations extracted hydrogen and processed it into forms suitable for both plasma reactors and conventional fusion drives, ensuring that Imperial vessels could operate indefinitely in regions far from established supply bases. Communication across such vast distances necessitated an expansion of the astropathic network. The Scholastica Psychona increased its training programs, producing more astropaths to meet growing demands. Relay stations were established at strategic points throughout Imperial space, creating a network that could pass messages across tens of thousands of light years through multiple transmissions. While individual astropathic communications remained somewhat unreliable, the redundancy built into this system ensured that critical information eventually reached its destination, albeit sometimes with significant delays. The Astronomicon, powered by the Emperor's psychic might and maintained by thousands of psychers, provided the navigational reference point essential for this expansion. Its range had been steadily increasing as the Emperor refined the technology and more psychers were added to its choir. By the height of the Crusade, its light reliably reached nearly 50,000 light-years from Terra, though its intensity diminished with distance. Beyond this range, navigation became increasingly difficult, requiring specialized techniques and accepting greater inaccuracy in warp translations. The administrative framework governing this vast empire continued to evolve during this period. The initial compliance protocols developed during the early Crusade proved insufficient for managing an Imperium of 1,000,000 worlds. Malcador the Sigillite, recognizing this challenge, implemented a tithe system that categorized worlds according to their resources and capabilities, assigning appropriate contribution levels to each. This system, while seemingly simple, represented a massive undertaking in data collection and analysis, requiring comprehensive surveys of every compliant world. The Council of Terra expanded its membership and authority to address these growing administrative demands. Originally comprising just 7 members personally selected by the Emperor, the Council grew to include representatives from major imperial institutions and regions. Specialized committees formed to address specific aspects of governance, from resource allocation to judicial oversight. The Council's decisions carried the Emperor's authority, though in practice many directives required months or years to implement across the vast distances of the Imperium. This administrative expansion created tensions with the military hierarchy. The Primarchs, accustomed to exercising both military and civilian authority in their areas of operation, sometimes found their decisions countermanded by council directives. Horus, as War Master, attempted to mediate these conflicts, but the fundamental division between civilian and military authority created structural friction that would later contribute to the heresy. The scale of imperial expansion during this period is perhaps best illustrated by the resources committed to frontier operations. At any given time, approximately 40% of all Space Marine legions were deployed beyond established imperial borders, with another 35% engaged in consolidation operations in recently compliant regions. The remaining 25% were either in transit, undergoing resupply and reinforcement, or addressing specific threats within established territory. This distribution meant that over 3/4 of the Imperium's most elite forces were consistently operating at the edges of human space, pushing the boundaries of the Imperium ever outward. The Imperial Army maintained an even more extensive presence, with an estimated 65% of its forces deployed to frontier regions. These troops typically followed behind Astartes' spearheads, securing compliant worlds and establishing permanent garrisons. The army's role expanded significantly during this period, as the growing Imperium required more conventional forces to maintain control over its vast territories. Specialized army formations developed for particular environments or mission profiles, creating a more diverse and adaptable force than the relatively uniform armies of the early Crusade. The Mechanicum similarly committed unprecedented resources to expansion, with explorator fleets operating alongside military expeditions throughout the galaxy. These technical specialists not only supported combat operations, but also assessed newly discovered technologies and established industrial infrastructure on compliant worlds. Their quest for lost knowledge drove them to explore the most distant regions, sometimes venturing beyond even the furthest military expeditions in search of Dark Age technologies. This period of maximum expansion created a sense of unstoppable momentum throughout the Imperium. With the Great Crusade achieving victory after victory, many believed that complete galactic dominance was merely a matter of time. The Imperial Truth spread across thousands of worlds, replacing local beliefs with the Emperor's secular rationalism. The various Xenos threats that had preyed on humanity during the Age of Strife were being systematically eliminated. Human worlds that had developed in isolation for millennia were being reintegrated into a unified species-wide civilization. Yet beneath this apparent triumph lay growing challenges that would ultimately threaten the Imperium's foundation. The very scale of conquest created strains that tested even the sophisticated systems established to manage it. As the distance between Terra and the frontier increased, so too did the practical autonomy of those operating at the edge of Imperial space. The Primarchs, already inclined toward independence by their nature and upbringing, increasingly made decisions without consulting Terra, justified by the impracticality of waiting months for instructions that might no longer be relevant when received. As the Great Crusade expanded across the galaxy, the first hairline cracks began to appear in the monumental edifice of the Imperium. The separation between the Emperor and his Primarchs created a void that administrative structures alone could not fill. The newly formed Council of Terra, established to manage the burgeoning Imperium's administrative needs, soon became a source of friction with the warrior Primarchs who had grown accustomed to near absolute authority in their respective spheres. The council, comprised primarily of high-ranking bureaucrats and administrators with little or no military experience, issued directives that often seemed disconnected from frontline realities. When the council imposed standardized compliance protocols that required extensive documentation before newly conquered worlds could be considered fully integrated, Angron of the World Eaters openly defied the mandate. He continued his brutal compliance methods without submitting the required reports, dismissing what he called Quill Pusher's demands with characteristic contempt. This tension between military and civilian authority reflected a fundamental shift in the Imperium's power structure. During the early Crusade, command flowed directly from the Emperor to his generals in the field. The Primarchs operated with considerable autonomy, but understood that their authority derived from their father. With the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra and the rise of the Council, this clear chain of command became muddled. The Council claimed to speak with the Emperor's authority, yet lacked his presence and charisma. Many Primarchs questioned whether these administrators truly understood the Emperor's vision, or were merely interpreting it through their limited bureaucratic perspective. Perdurabo of the Iron Warriors expressed this frustration after receiving council directives regarding garrison deployment in the Olympia sector. "They count bodies and measure ammunition stores," he told his first captain, "but they cannot measure determination or calculate the weight of sacrifice." The Iron Warriors, already tasked with holding the most grueling siege lines and fortress worlds, found their requests for reinforcement denied by council officials, who deemed such deployments inefficient resource allocation. The administrative demands placed on the legions increased substantially under council governance. Quarterly compliance assessments, resource utilization reviews, and strategic justification reports consumed time and attention that many Primarchs felt would be better spent on campaign planning. Robute Guilliman's Ultramarines adapted readily to these requirements, their Primarch's administrative acumen allowing them to satisfy council demands without compromising operational effectiveness. Other legions proved less accommodating. The Night Lords under Conrad Kurz simply ignored many council directives, continuing their terror campaigns with little regard for formal compliance procedures. When pressed, Kurz responded with thinly veiled threats that discouraged further inquiry. The Death Guard under Mortarion submitted reports so thoroughly contaminated with radiation that few council scribes were willing to handle them, effectively deterring administrative oversight. These passive resistances reflected growing disillusionment with the Imperium's increasingly bureaucratic nature. Beyond these tensions with Terra, relationships between the Primarchs themselves grew increasingly strained. The Emperor had created his sons with complementary but distinct personalities and aptitudes, intending them to function as parts of a greater whole. Without his unifying presence, however, these differences began to foster division rather than synergy. The philosophical schism between Lorgar of the Word-Bearers and Guilliman of the Ultramarines exemplified these growing divides. Following his censure at Monarchia, Lorgar had outwardly embraced the Imperial Truth while privately pursuing alternative spiritual paths. Guilliman, firmly committed to the Emperor's secular vision, viewed Lorgar's continued interest in matters of faith with increasing suspicion. When the two legions conducted joint operations in the Arcturan sector, their contrasting approaches created tangible friction. Lorgar's word-bearers spent considerable time establishing cultural compliance, replacing local religious practices with carefully crafted civic rituals that subtly incorporated elements of their emerging chaos worship disguised as imperial ceremony. Guilliman's Ultramarines focused on establishing efficient governance structures and integrating the sector's resources into imperial supply chains. The Ultramarines completed their assigned compliance actions months ahead of schedule, while the word-bearers remained engaged in what Guilliman characterized as unnecessary cultural engineering. This difference in approach led to a confrontation between the Primarchs that, while not escalating to open hostility, established a lasting animosity. Guilliman accused Lorgar of inefficiency and misplaced priorities. Lorgar countered that his brother's mechanical approach to compliance created imperial citizens in name only, lacking true devotion to the imperial cause. Neither Primarch fully articulated the fundamental philosophical difference underlying their dispute. Guilliman saw the Imperium as a practical framework for human advancement, while Lorgar increasingly viewed it as a flawed vehicle for spiritual transcendence. Similar philosophical disagreements emerged between other Primarchs. Jagatai Khan and Lion L. Johnson clashed over compliance methods during the Kondax campaign, with the Khan favoring swift strikes that left local governance largely intact, while the Lion advocated for complete dismantling and rebuilding of native power structures. Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim, once close allies, found their friendship strained by Fulgrim's growing obsession with perfection that Manus considered impractical and self-indulgent. These tensions occasionally erupted into more serious confrontations. During joint operations against the Orc Empire in the Goro system, Angron's World Eaters launched a premature assault that disrupted Rogel Dorn's carefully planned siege. The resulting battle achieved victory, but at a cost in Imperial lives that Dorn considered unconscionable. The confrontation between the Primarchs afterward nearly escalated to violence, with Angron dismissing Dorn's bloodless mathematics of war, while Dorn condemned Angron's mindless butchery. Only the intervention of Horus prevented the dispute from escalating further. Horus, as War Master, found himself increasingly occupied with mediating these fraternal disputes. His diplomatic skills were tested as never before as he attempted to balance the Primarchs, competing egos and divergent approaches while maintaining the Crusade's momentum. This responsibility isolated him from his brothers in subtle ways, transforming him from first among equals to a figure of authority many resented. Horus confided to his equerry Malaghurst that he sometimes felt caught between Terra's demands and his brother's resistance, with neither side fully appreciating the pressures he faced. The question of psyker usage within the legions became another source of significant division. Magnus, the Red's Thousand Sons, embraced their psychic gifts, incorporating warp-based powers into every aspect of their operations. Mortarion's Death Guard and Leman Russ's Space Wolves viewed such practices with deep suspicion, considering them dangerous and potentially corrupting. Other legions occupied various positions along this spectrum, creating a contentious issue that transcended simple tactical disagreement. The debate reached its peak following the Aghoru compliance, where Thousand Suns librarians used their powers to communicate with a Xenos entity the Space Wolves had intended to destroy. The resulting confrontation between Legion forces required Horus's personal intervention to prevent bloodshed. In the aftermath, both Magnus and Russ appealed to the War Master for support of their positions, placing Horus in an impossible mediating role. The intensity of this disagreement prompted Malkador the Sigillite to advise the Emperor that a definitive ruling on psychic usage had become necessary. The Emperor agreed, recognizing that allowing this division to fester threatened the Crusade's cohesion. He summoned representatives from all legions to Nicaea, a remote world chosen specifically for its isolation and neutrality, to address what had become known as the Librarian Question. The Council of Nicaea represented the most significant gathering of imperial leadership since the triumph of Ulaner. All 18 active Primarchs attended either in person or via secure Vox link, alongside senior representatives from the Mechanicum, the Silent Sisterhood, and various Imperial Army commands. The Emperor himself presided, one of his few public appearances since returning to Terra. The debate proceeded formally, with designated speakers presenting arguments for and against sanctioned psychic usage within the legions. Magnus defended the Librarius program passionately, arguing that controlled psychic development represented humanity's evolutionary destiny and provided essential tools for combating warp-based threats. Mortarion countered with equally fervent opposition, recounting instances where psychic powers had led to corruption and disaster on his homeworld of Barbarus. Other Primarchs offered more nuanced positions. Sanguinius acknowledged the risks of psychic power, but suggested that proper training and oversight could mitigate these dangers. Corvus Corax proposed strict limitations rather than outright prohibition, allowing psychic usage only in specific tactical situations. Fulgrim advocated for a case-by-case assessment based on each legion's demonstrated control and discipline. The Emperor listened to these arguments in silence, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When all designated speakers had concluded, he rendered his judgment. The Librarius programs would be disbanded, and the use of psychic powers by Space Marines prohibited. However, he established the framework for a future librarian program that would operate under strict Imperial oversight, suggesting that this prohibition might not be permanent once proper safeguards were developed. This ruling satisfied neither extreme. Magnus considered it a rejection of humanity's potential and a personal rebuke of his legion's practices. Mortarion and Russ viewed the provision for a future Librarius as an unacceptable compromise with forces they considered inherently dangerous. Even Primarchs with moderate positions found the Emperor's decision problematic for different reasons, some considering it too restrictive, others not restrictive enough. The Emperor's failure to fully explain his reasoning contributed to this dissatisfaction. He presented the decision as necessary for the Imperium's security without elaborating on the specific dangers he foresaw. This opacity, combined with his increasingly distant manner, left many Primarchs feeling that their perspectives had not been truly considered. Magnus, in particular, departed Nicaea with a sense of betrayal that would have profound consequences. The implementation of the Nicaea Edict created practical challenges for legions that had integrated psychic abilities into their operational doctrine. The Thousand Suns faced the most significant disruption, as their entire combat approach relied heavily on coordinated psychic actions. The Blood Angels and White Scars, while less dependent on such powers, still required substantial tactical adjustments. Even legions like the Ultramarines, which had maintained only modest Librarius programs, found certain specialized capabilities suddenly unavailable. Beyond these practical concerns, the Nicaea Edict highlighted a growing cultural divide within the Imperium. The Emperor had founded his realm on the Imperial Truth, a rationalist, secular philosophy that rejected superstition and religious thinking. Yet his prohibition of psychic powers seemed to many Astartes to stem from fear rather than reason, particularly as the Emperor himself was known to be the most powerful human psyker in existence. This apparent contradiction created cognitive dissonance that undermined confidence in the consistency of imperial doctrine. The edict also revealed divergent interpretations of the Imperial Truth itself. Some legions, particularly the word-bearers and emperor's children, had begun to view the truth less as a philosophical framework and more as a set of doctrinal pronouncements to be followed without question. Others, like the Thousand Sons and Alpha Legion, interpreted it as encouraging intellectual exploration within certain boundaries. These different understandings reflected broader cultural differences that had developed as the legions evolved distinct identities. The Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists exemplified another form of ideological division. Both legions excelled at siege warfare and fortification, but approached these specialties from fundamentally different perspectives. Rogel Dorn's Imperial Fists viewed defensive works as expressions of permanence and security, physical manifestations of the Imperium's enduring nature. Perturabo's Iron Warriors saw them as necessary evils, pragmatic responses to a hostile universe rather than symbols of imperial glory. This philosophical difference informed their broader views of the Imperium itself. The Imperial Fists embraced the ideal of unity, seeing the Imperium as humanity's destined form. The Iron Warriors maintained a more transactional relationship with imperial authority, viewing it as a useful structure, but not inherently sacred or eternal. Similar divergences existed across other legion pairs. The Night Lords and Dark Angels both maintained strict discipline, but for entirely different reasons. The Salamanders and Death Guard both valued resilience, but expressed this trait in contrasting ways. As these cultural and ideological divisions deepened, practical cooperation between legions became increasingly difficult. Joint operations that had once proceeded smoothly now required extensive negotiation and compromise. The Kava's Persecution, a campaign against Dark Eldar raiders that involved elements from 5 different legions, became notorious for its command disputes and coordination failures. What should have been a straightforward operation stretched into a grueling 18-month campaign due largely to inter-legion friction. Horus attempted to address these growing divisions by establishing regular conclave meetings where Primarchs could air grievances and resolve disputes in a controlled environment. These gatherings achieved limited success, often serving more to formalize existing divisions than to heal them. The Primarchs, designed to be distinct individuals rather than identical copies, found their differences amplified by the stresses of continuous warfare and the absence of their father's unifying presence. The cultural drift extended beyond the Primarchs to affect their legions at all levels. Astartes, who had once served together in mixed legion task forces, now found themselves struggling to understand their cousins' methods and motivations. Training exchanges between legions became less frequent, and when they occurred, often highlighted incompatibilities rather than creating mutual understanding. The Great Crusade had sought to unite all humanity under a single banner, but the reality of human diversity made complete standardization impossible. Different human populations had evolved distinct cultural practices and even physiological adaptations during the long isolation of Old Night. Some, like the void-adapted humans of the Adrantes Nebula or the radiation-resistant clans of Baal Secundus, possessed genetic modifications that made them visibly distinct from baseline humanity. The Imperium's approach to these variations became another source of ideological division. Some Primarchs, particularly Vulcan and Corvus Corax, advocated for inclusive policies that accommodated human diversity within the broader imperial framework. Others, like Mortarion and Fulgrim, favored stricter definitions of acceptable human variation, viewing significant deviations as potential threats to species cohesion. This disagreement played out most visibly during the compliance of the Osiris Cluster, where human populations had developed extensive genetic modifications to survive their toxic homeworlds. Mortarion's Death Guard recommended purging these populations as deviant, while Vulcan's salamanders argued for their acceptance as legitimate expressions of human adaptability. The dispute escalated to Horus, who ultimately ruled in favor of acceptance with monitoring, a compromise that satisfied neither faction completely. As the Great Crusade approached its 2nd century, the pace of imperial expansion began to subtly shift. The explosive growth that had characterized the decades following Ulanor gradually gave way to a more measured approach focused on consolidation and governance. The final major campaigns before the heresy reflected this changing emphasis, with several Primarchs redirecting their efforts from pure conquest to establishing sustainable imperial rule in their areas of operation. The Arc-Reach Cluster campaign exemplified this transition. What began as a standard compliance action by the Thousand Sons evolved into a complex operation involving multiple legions. The cluster contained human civilizations that had maintained advanced technology through the Age of Strife, making them valuable additions to the Imperium. However, these societies had developed in isolation for millennia, creating cultural and political structures resistant to imperial integration. Magnus the Red initially approached the campaign with characteristic scholarly interest, documenting the cluster's unique technological developments while implementing standard compliance protocols. The discovery of extensive psychic practices among the population complicated matters, especially in the wake of the Nicaea Edict. When local resistance stiffened, the Space Wolves were deployed as reinforcements, bringing their anti-psyker stance into direct conflict with Magnus's more accommodating approach. The resulting operation succeeded militarily, but highlighted the growing divisions within the Crusade's leadership. The compliance was achieved at the cost of destroying much of the cultural and technological uniqueness that had made the cluster valuable in the first place. This pattern, successful military action undermined by ideological conflicts, became increasingly common in the Crusade's final years. In the Galactic East, the Ultramarines conducted their last major expansion campaign in what would later become Ultramar. Roboute Guilliman had developed a distinct approach to imperial expansion, focusing on creating sustainable governance structures rather than merely achieving military compliance. The 500 Worlds campaign saw his legion methodically integrating dozens of star systems into a cohesive network, establishing standardized administrative protocols that allowed these disparate worlds to function as a unified entity. Guilliman's approach represented a natural evolution of the Crusade's purpose. Where earlier compliance actions had focused primarily on bringing worlds under imperial authority, the Ultramarines now emphasized creating lasting structures that would allow these territories to contribute meaningfully to the broader Imperium. This shift reflected Guilliman's understanding that conquest without consolidation was ultimately futile, a perspective that put him increasingly at odds with more militant Primarchs. The Death Guard under Mortarion conducted their final significant campaign against the Xenos' tainted human enclaves in the Barbarous sector. Named after Mortarion's homeworld, this region contained numerous human populations that had fallen under alien influence during the Age of Strife. The Death Guard's approach was characteristically ruthless, with entire populations purged where evidence of Xenos contamination was found. This campaign highlighted the tension between the Imperium's goal of human unification and its zero-tolerance policy toward alien influence, a tension that created significant administrative challenges as the Crusade transitioned toward governance. As these final campaigns unfolded across the galaxy, a profound shift was occurring at the heart of the Imperium. On Terra, the Emperor had withdrawn almost completely from public view, focusing his immense psychic power and intellectual resources on the Imperial Webway project. This undertaking represented perhaps the most ambitious technological achievement attempted since the Dark Age of technology, nothing less than creating a human-controlled network of tunnels through the Immaterium that would free mankind from dependence on warp travel. The project's origins dated back to the Emperor's mysterious journey to Malech decades earlier, where he had apparently acquired crucial knowledge about the Webway's fundamental nature. Upon returning to Terra after Ulanor, he had immediately begun constructing massive psychic and technological infrastructure beneath the Imperial Palace. The Golden Throne, initially designed as an interface device allowing the Emperor to direct the Webway's construction, stood at the center of this complex. The scale of resources devoted to this project was staggering. Thousands of Mechanicum adepts worked continuously on technical aspects of the Webway interface, while the Emperor himself spent months at a time seated upon the Golden Throne, his consciousness projected into the half-real spaces between reality and the warp where the Webway existed. Hundreds of psychers were sacrificed daily to power auxiliary systems, their life force channeled into maintaining the complex psychic shielding required to protect the project from warp predators. The strategic implications of the Imperial Webway, had it been completed, cannot be overstated. Warp travel, while necessary for interstellar civilization, remained dangerous and unreliable. Ships occasionally disappeared entirely, arrived centuries off schedule, or returned with crews driven mad by warp exposure. The Astronomicon provided a navigational reference point, but its range was limited, and its maintenance required constant sacrifice of psychers. The Webway would have eliminated these vulnerabilities. Based on the ancient network created by the Eldari, but modified for human use, it would have allowed instantaneous travel between connected points without exposure to the warp's dangers. Imperial ships could have moved between star systems in hours rather than weeks or months, with no risk of temporal distortion or demonic attack. Communications would have been similarly improved, creating a truly unified Imperium, where coordination between distant sectors occurred in real time rather than with months of delay. Beyond these practical benefits, the Webway represented the Emperor's solution to humanity's greatest existential threat, its psychic awakening. Human psychers were becoming more common with each generation, creating increasing vulnerability to warp predators. The Emperor foresaw a future where humanity would evolve into a fully psychic species like the Eldari, but without the protection of a controlled Webway network, such evolution would inevitably attract the attention of entities that fed on psychic energy. The Imperial Webway was not merely a transportation system, but a species-saving technology that would allow humanity to evolve safely. The secrecy surrounding this project created significant political complications. Even the Primarchs were given only vague explanations for their father's withdrawal from the Crusade. This information vacuum contributed to the growing sense of abandonment among the Emperor's sons and fueled speculation about his true intentions. Some, like Horus, began to wonder if the Emperor had simply used them to achieve his immediate goals before moving on to more important matters. As the Emperor focused on the Webway, the practical governance of the Imperium increasingly fell to Malcador the Sigillite and the Council of Terra. This shift from military leadership to civilian administration represented another significant transition in the Crusade's final years. The Council, comprised primarily of administrators and bureaucrats with little or no combat experience, approached imperial governance from a perspective that often clashed with the military pragmatism of the Primarchs. New taxation systems were implemented to fund the Imperium's growing administrative needs. Compliance protocols were standardized and formalized, reducing the autonomy that expedition fleets had previously enjoyed. Resource allocation became increasingly centralized, with the Council making decisions about which campaigns deserved priority based on economic rather than strategic considerations. These changes, while necessary for long-term stability, created friction with military leaders accustomed to operational freedom. The establishment of the Adeptus Terra as a formal governmental body marked the institutionalization of this civilian authority. Unlike the ad hoc administrative structures of the early Crusade, the Adeptus Terra represented a permanent bureaucracy designed to manage the Imperium in perpetuity. Its various divisions, the Administratum, the Adeptus Munitorum, the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, and others, formed specialized organs within this growing governmental body. This administrative expansion coincided with a gradual reduction in the legions, Astartes' non-military authority. Where Space Marines had once served as governors, judges, and administrators on newly compliant worlds, these roles increasingly fell to civilian officials dispatched from Terra. The Primarchs and their legions were expected to focus solely on military matters, leaving governance to those specifically trained for it. Some Primarchs adapted readily to this new paradigm. Guilliman had always maintained a clear distinction between military and civilian authority in his operations. Dorn viewed the formalization of imperial governance as a natural evolution toward the stable, ordered Imperium he had always envisioned. Others, particularly Angron and Mortarion, had never shown interest in administrative matters and were content to focus exclusively on warfare. For many Primarchs, however, This shift represented an unwelcome diminishment of their authority. Horus, who had effectively functioned as both military leader and civilian administrator in his campaigns, found his governance decisions increasingly overruled by council directives. Perdurabo, who had implemented complex social engineering projects on worlds brought to compliance by the Iron Warriors, saw these efforts dismantled and replaced with standardized imperial systems. Lorgar, whose compliance actions had always emphasized cultural and spiritual transformation, faced particular resistance from the secular bureaucracy. This tension between military and civilian authority created administrative inefficiencies that hampered the Crusade's final years. Expedition fleets found themselves waiting for council approval before implementing compliance measures, while civilian administrators arrived on newly conquered worlds with little understanding of local conditions. The practical partnership between military conquest and civilian integration that had characterized the Crusade's most successful periods began to break down as these spheres of authority became increasingly separate and sometimes antagonistic. Despite these growing pains, the Imperium at the close of the Great Crusade represented an achievement unparalleled in human history. From a single world, humanity had reclaimed a domain spanning millions of stars. Ancient technologies lost during Old Night had been rediscovered and implemented across thousands of worlds. Human populations that had developed in isolation for millennia were reintegrated into a species-wide civilization. Xeno's threats that had preyed on scattered human colonies were systematically eliminated, creating unprecedented security for Imperial citizens. The infrastructure supporting this vast domain was equally impressive. Standardized manufacturing protocols ensured that equipment produced on distant Forge worlds would be compatible with systems built in the Sol system. Astropathic choirs maintained communication networks spanning tens of thousands of light years. The Imperial army garrisoned hundreds of thousands of worlds, while the legions Astartes stood ready to respond to any threat too great for conventional forces to handle. The Great Crusade's legacy extended beyond these material achievements to encompass profound cultural transformations. The Imperial Truth had replaced thousands of local belief systems with a unified philosophical framework emphasizing human potential and scientific understanding. Technical education had been standardized across compliant worlds, creating a common technological language that facilitated innovation and knowledge transfer. Even basic measures like standardized timekeeping, measurement systems, and currency created a sense of unity that transcended local planetary identities. Yet beneath these remarkable achievements lay the seeds of catastrophe. The Emperor's absence had created a leadership vacuum that the Council of Terra could not fully fill. The Primarchs, created as both generals and statesmen, found their role increasingly restricted to military matters at precisely the moment when the Crusade was transitioning toward governance. The separation between Terra's administrative authority and the expeditionary fleet's practical experience created systemic inefficiencies and resentments. Most dangerously, the philosophical unity that had driven the early Crusade had fragmented into competing visions of humanity's future. Some Primarchs remained committed to the secular rationalism of the Imperial Truth, while others had begun exploring alternative perspectives that incorporated spiritual or mystical elements. Some embraced the transition toward civilian governance, while others resisted what they saw as bureaucratic interference in military matters. These divisions, initially manageable through the Emperor's personal authority, became increasingly problematic in his absence. As the Great Crusade wound down, it left behind an Imperium poised between two possible futures. One path led toward the realization of the Emperor's vision, a unified human civilization spanning the galaxy, freed from the dangers of the warp by the Imperial webway, evolving toward a psychic maturity that would establish mankind as the dominant species in the universe. The other path led toward fragmentation, civil war, and stagnation, the collapse of the Imperial dream into millennia of superstition and decline. The choices made by the Emperor's sons in the wake of his withdrawal to Terra would determine which of these futures would come to pass. The Great Crusade had united humanity across the stars, but maintaining that unity would prove a challenge beyond even the capabilities of the transhuman Primarchs. As Horus struggled with the burdens of the War Master's mantle, and the Emperor focused his attention on the webway, the stage was set for the greatest tragedy in human history, a conflict that would transform the bright promise of the Great Crusade into 10,000 years of darkness and war.